Hello, friends, and welcome to Moonlight Science, where we slow the world down and drift through the mysteries of our planet, one gentle breath at a time. Tonight, we're traveling far deeper than memory, to an age when Earth did something almost unimaginable. It burned, not for a season, not for a century, but for so long the very calendar seemed to smolder. Lava welled up from wounds in the crust, ash dimmed the sky, and warmth gathered like a blanket you couldn't kick off. This isn't legend, it's written in stone. If Soft Wonder speaks to you, give this a like, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from. Loosen your shoulders, settle in, and let's step softly into the firelit past. Beneath the calm surface of an ancient world, the first stirrings of disaster began where no eyes could see. In the mantle, that vast, slow sea of molten rock beneath Earth's crust, something was moving. For millions of years, heat had gathered in pockets far below, trapped by layers of dense rock that refused to let it rise. But nothing in nature holds still forever. Eventually, that heat began to push upward, forming giant columns of molten energy called mantle plumes. They were not violent yet. They rose with the patience of mountains growing, drifting through the mantle like ghostly lanterns glowing red in the dark. At the surface, all was peace. Forests spread thick and ancient, rivers coiled lazily through plains, and creatures wandered without suspicion. To them, the world seemed eternal. Skies predictable, seasons steady. But far below, pressure was building, and the crust, that thin shell of solid ground, began to stretch like a drum skin drawn too tight. Fissures widened grain by grain. Rocks shifted in slow, grinding whispers that no living ear could hear. The planet itself was holding its breath. One day, that breath exhaled in fire. It did not happen as a single explosion or sudden catastrophe. It began with a faint shimmer on the horizon, a line of light where none had been before. Cracks opened, long and thin, running for hundreds of kilometers like fresh scars across the land. From those wounds, magma surged, not in brief eruptions like modern volcanoes, but in relentless curtains of fire. Lava spilled in sheets, flowing not down mountainsides but across entire plains, spreading until forests turned to smoke and rivers hissed to steam. The earth had caught fire, and the flame would not go out for 1,000,000 years. What followed was not chaos all at once, but rhythm. Eruptions came in pulses. A surge of molten rock would flood the land for decades, then fade. The world would seem to recover. Grasses and ferns crept back into the blackened fields. Animals returned cautiously, sniffing the scorched air. But then, without warning, another pulse would come. More magma, more ash, another slow disaster spreading like a tide. Layer after layer, flow after flow, the land began to rise under its own burning weight. Time, these layers would cool and harden into dark stone, forming vast plateaus we can still see today, monuments to endurance and destruction alike. Geologists would one day call them flood basalts, the scars of a planet's fiery heartbeat. But back then, no names existed. Only the raw spectacle of molten rivers pouring from the ground as if the planet were bleeding light. The skies, too, began to change. Ash climbed miles into the air, turning daylight into twilight and painting sunsets the color of copper and rust. Tiny particles reflected sunlight back into space, and for a while, the world shivered under a dim chill. Frost touched the edges of leaves that had never known cold before. But the same eruptions that cooled the surface also filled the air with gases, carbon dioxide and methane, that trapped heat. When the ash finally settled, The warmth returned with a vengeance. Winters grew short and strange. Summers refused to end. The world swung between cold and heat like a pendulum made of smoke. To the creatures that lived then, it must have felt like living under a sky that could not decide whether to freeze or burn them. But the earth was not cruel. It was restless. What was happening beneath the crust was part of a larger story, a cycle of renewal written in magma and time. Each eruption vented the planet's inner energy, balancing forces that might otherwise have torn it apart. Yet to life on the surface, that balance came at a terrible cost. Forests turned to char, rivers filled with ash and stones, oceans simmered near the coasts. And still, the fire did not stop. Deep in the mantle, the plumes kept feeding the flames. They rose in slow motion, each pulse of molten rock taking hundreds of thousands of years to reach the surface. Once there, it burst free, adding another chapter to the long burn. Across what would one day be Siberia, India, and other lands, now scattered by time and drift, these fiery provinces spread wider than modern continents. The atmosphere thickened with volcanic breath, and the ground trembled with a heartbeat that could last centuries. And yet, between the devastation, life continued. Some plants survived by clinging to the edges of lava flows, their roots finding new soil in the cracks of cooling stone. Insects returned first, then the small scurrying things that fed on them. Life, fragile but stubborn, learned to live in the pauses between disasters. For the planet, this was not merely destruction, it was transformation. The Earth was remaking itself from the inside out. Old landscapes were buried, but in their place, new ones formed. Fresh rock waiting to weather into soil, new minerals to feed future ecosystems. Even as fire consumed the surface, it prepared the ground for worlds yet to come. The story of how Earth burned for 1,000,000 years is not only a story of endings. It is a story of beginnings, of the deep machinery that powers change and the resilience that refuses to fade. The Garsu sparks that rose from the mantle would ignite more than forests and skies. They would ignite the next great turning in the history of life itself. And so, as the first plumes reached their peak and the surface cracked open to greet them, the age of fire truly began. Before the first spark rose from the mantle, the earth was calm. Or at least, it seemed that way. Millions of years of steady climate had sculpted a planet that felt almost peaceful, its rhythms so dependable that even the smallest creature could sense the season by scent or shadow. The continents were arranged differently then, drawn together into a vast supercontinent that stretched from pole to pole. Its heart a land of red deserts, green river valleys, and ancient forests heavy with mist. The air carried more carbon dioxide than it does today, lending warmth to every breeze and life to every leaf. Forests blanketed the lowlands, filled with towering conifers, ginkgos, and the fronded elegance of seed ferns. Their trunks rose straight and tall, wrapped in vines that shimmered when the wind whispered through the canopy. Beneath them grew thick carpets of horsetails and cycads, their roots drinking from clear streams that wound lazily between stones coated with algae and moss. The scent of resin and damp earth drifted through the air, a perfume of stability, a sign of a world at equilibrium. In the seas, the balance continued. Warm shallows teemed with ammonites, coiled and iridescent, their shells catching sunlight that danced through clear blue water. Shoals of fish darted like silver ribbons, chased by predators shaped like living armor. Coral-like reefs built by sponges and microbial colonies stretched for miles, sheltering countless species that had never known disturbance. Even in the depths, where sunlight never reached, Currents moved with a steady pulse that had persisted for ages, carrying nutrients upward and life downward in an endless exchange. The creatures of this time had evolved to match that certainty. Reptiles basked on warm riverbanks, their bodies sleek and strong, their habits unhurried. Amphibians lingered in the wetlands, their eggs resting in shallow pools that never seemed to dry. Insects hummed in clouds above the ferns, their flight patterns practiced, perfected over generations. Each form of life had found its niche and mastered it. The world was not chaotic but choreographed, a living symphony tuned to the steady metronome of time. But hidden within that stability was a kind of fragility. Long ages of gentle seasons had bred complacency into the fabric of life. Plants had grown accustomed to predictable rains, to sunlight that rose and fell in familiar patterns. Animals had synchronized their migrations, their breeding, and their hibernations to the same unbroken rhythm. The ecosystem was balanced, yes, but balanced like a tower of glass, tall and beautiful, yet perilously sensitive to even the slightest tremor. There is a quiet truth in nature. Resilience is born of struggle. Where environments shift often, species learn to bend. But in this age of calm, bending had become unnecessary. Adaptation slowed. Each species fit perfectly into its role, but those roles were carved too precisely, leaving little room to change. If the climate were to tilt, just slightly, many would find themselves stranded in forms no longer suited to the world around them. They did not know it, but life on Earth had become a masterpiece too fine to withstand disturbance. Still, to live in that time must have felt like paradise. The days were long and mild, the nights cool and fragrant. Rain came in soft patterns, feeding rivers that glittered beneath two pale moons. From the highlands, vast herds of early reptiles moved in slow waves, grazing on the low vegetation that grew where water pooled after seasonal floods. Overhead, primitive pterosaurs glided on leathery wings, their shadows rippling across the surface of lakes. The world was alive with sound, the croak of amphibians, the calls of distant predators, the steady hum of insects. Nothing hinted at the violence gathering beneath the crust. If one could have stood then on the crest of a ridge and looked out over that ancient landscape, the scene would have felt eternal. Clouds drifted lazily across blue skies. Mountains glowed with green and gold where the sun touched their slopes. Rivers traced silver threads through forests so vast they seemed endless. It was a planet breathing in balance, confident, unhurried, unaware. But deep below, change was already stirring. Heat was rising through layers of stone older than the forests themselves. The first fractures were forming far beneath the roots of mountains, slow and invisible. The creatures of the surface could not feel it, but the planet's pulse was quickening. The peace above was an illusion, a calm before a fire no living thing could imagine. Yet even in hindsight, it is difficult to call this world naive. It was not foolish in its stillness. It was simply doing what life always does when conditions allow. It flourished. Every fern that unfurled, every creature that hatched, every grain of pollen carried by the wind was part of a story unaware of its coming turn. The surface of the earth glowed with life, but that glow would soon be mirrored by another, one of molten rock and burning skies. The forests that now whispered in the wind would one day smolder beneath layers of ash. The tranquil seas, rich with color and sound, would grow dark and still. But none of that was visible yet. For now, the world remained serene, its creatures moving through their days as they always had, under a sun that seemed an endless. If you had listened closely, though, and placed your hand against the ground, perhaps you might have felt it. the faintest tremor, a pulse beneath your palm, like a heartbeat coming from the bones of the planet itself. It was not loud. It was not urgent. It was only a whisper, the first signal that something deep below was waking, and that the long season of calm was about to end. Far below the quiet forests and the wandering rivers of that ancient world, something immense was gathering its strength. The mantle, a deep sea of solid rock that moves slower than continents drift, was restless. Heat, ancient and persistent, was rising in plumes, enormous columns of molten energy welling upward from the boundary between Earth's core and mantle. They moved not in seconds or hours, but in the rhythm of deep time, creeping through rock as if through honey, spreading slowly outward as they neared the surface. For millions of years, that heat had been building, trapped under a crust that was thick and unyielding. The continents above acted like a lid on a simmering pot, holding back energy that had nowhere to go. In most times, Earth releases its inner warmth gently. A volcanic island here, a mountain range there. But when too much pressure gathers, balance must be restored in more dramatic ways. And now, beneath the heart of the supercontinent, the scales had tipped. The first signs of change were invisible. Deep within the mantle, the rising plumes caused the rocks above them to swell and thin, bulging upward ever so slightly. This wasn't yet eruption, only preparation, a slow drawing of breath. Rock under pressure behaves strangely. Though solid, it can flow when pushed over great spans of time. As the plumes ascended, the weight above them decreased. Pressure fell, and with that fall came transformation. Hot rock, when decompressed, begins to melt. Not all at once, but grain by grain, until pockets of molten magma form between crystals. These droplets gathered, merged, and coalesced into reservoirs. Vast chambers of glowing liquid stone trapped miles beneath the crust. There they waited, buoyant and hungry, pressing upward against their prison of solid rock. The crust, though strong, was never unbreakable. Over hundreds of thousands of years, tension accumulated. It began as hairline cracks, deep and narrow, threading through ancient bedrock like veins of glass. Each tremor widened them a little more. The continents above groaned under invisible strain. Mountains shifted by inches. Valleys sank. Lakes drained and refilled as the land subtly flexed under the push from below. From the surface, life continued unaware. Forests grew thicker. Rivers wandered lazily across the plains, and the air buzzed with the sound of wings. But if one could have seen through the soil, through the roots and stone, they would have witnessed a world transforming in slow motion. The crust fracturing like a frozen lake under weight too great to bear. Within those deep fractures, magma began to move. It crept upward, not yet free, tracing the paths of least resistance. Each thread of molten rock was a silent herald of the fire to come. The heat softened nearby minerals, turning them into shimmering mosaics of red and gold. Gases trapped in the melt, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and water vapor, collected like bottled storms, waiting for the moment of release. Every chemical signature from that time would one day become a timestamp in stone. Future scientists would find traces of mercury and carbon spikes in ancient sediments, tiny signals written by this rising fire. But back then, there were no readers of rock, only the slow tightening of a process too immense for witness. The mantle plumes pressed harder. They were ancient forces of balance, shaped by the same physics that drives the drift of continents and the pulse of earthquakes. As they rose, they gathered not just heat, but intent. The crust was reaching its breaking point. Far above, perhaps the first true warning rippled through the earth. A vibration so faint it could have been mistaken for the sigh of wind through trees. Then came the low groan of rock giving way, a sound deep and resonant, like thunder without air. Cracks widened with unstoppable grace, linking into networks that stretched across hundreds of miles. Beneath rivers, beneath forests, beneath sleeping creatures, the first arteries of magma found their way to daylight. And then, one night, though night and day mattered little in such time, the surface split. Along the seams of the continent, red light flared. Not the brief flash of lightning, but a steady glow that grew and grew until the horizon itself seemed to burn. Lava welled up through the fractures and fountains of molten rock, spreading outward in glowing waves. The ground trembled underfoot, forests shuddered, and the air filled with a deep, resonant hum that was more felt than heard. The sound of a planet exhaling after ages of silence. The eruptions were not like the towering cones of modern volcanoes. There were no mountains exploding into the sky, no singular peaks spitting ash. These were curtains of fire, drawn across the landscape like the opening of some grand, terrible play. From fissures hundreds of kilometers long, lava poured in unbroken rivers, pooling in lowlands and sweeping over plains. Wherever it went, it erased trees, rivers, life itself, all folded into molten light. But this was only the beginning. The first fissures were scouts, testing the world's resolve. Beneath them, more magma gathered, more pressure mounted. The mantle plumes were not done rising. They would keep feeding this fire for ages. What had started as whispers in the deep would soon become an inferno stretching across continents. And so, under skies still blue and forests still green, the true culprits had awakened. Deep within the Earth's bones, molten veins pulsed with heat and purpose. The planet had begun its long transformation, one that would turn paradise to ash, then rebuild it anew. The red lines across the dark land were only the first scars, glowing softly against the night, marking the moment when silence gave way to flame. When the first eruption tore through the crust, the world did not end all at once. It began with a tremor that shivered through the soil, barely enough to rouse sleeping creatures or stir leaves from branches. Then came the sound, a low, endless rumble, like distant thunder rolling beneath the ground. At first, the air simply quivered. Then the horizon brightened, red at its edges, and a dull light bled upward, pulsing like a heartbeat. From the fissures that had opened weeks before, fountains of molten rock burst into the open air. They rose high, twisting and breaking apart, hurling droplets of fire that cooled into black glass before they hit the ground. For a few miles in every direction, the sky darkened with smoke. The wind carried the scent of sulfur and scorched earth, and the first flecks of ash began to fall. It did not fall like snow, not soft or silent, but like a slow, steady rain of dust that stung the eyes and stuck to skin. The ash was warm at first, then cool, then endless. It blanketed the leaves of the forests, turning green to gray. Ponds and lakes, once mirrors to the sky, grew opaque and still, their surfaces coated in fine soot. Animals wandered in confusion, blinking through the haze, coughing when they breathed too deeply. Some fled into rivers to wash the air from their nostrils. Others dug shallow burrows to escape the choking drift. Yet for all its strangeness, the ashfall was not total ruin. The first eruptions, though fierce, were local, scars on a vast planet that still felt whole. Days later, the wind shifted. A clean breeze rolled in from the sea, scattering the haze. Sunlight broke through, dimmed but golden, and the sky, though bruised, was blue again. The world seemed to exhale. For the creatures above, this was a relief. They returned to the open, shaking dust from their hides. Streams cleared, leaves unfurled new buds. Birds, or their ancient equivalents, filled the silence once more with song. The sense of danger faded as quickly as it had come. Disasters, after all, were supposed to end. But this one had only paused. Beneath the ground, pressure rebuilt. The fissures cooled at their edges, but remained molten within, like embers waiting for breath. Each eruption released some of the heat and gas, but not enough to calm the deep plumes feeding them. The crust was cracked now, a broken seal, and the planet was not finished speaking. For months, the sky would trade moods. Some days were clear and sharp, sunlight pouring through with the clean scent of pine and wet soil. Other days, without warning, ash would rise again in plumes that reached the edge of the stratosphere. Winds carried it farther each time, spreading a thin gray veil across the horizon. Sometimes it fell so lightly you could mistake it for fog. Sometimes it came in flurries thick enough to bury ferns, to bend the boughs of trees. In quiet ponds, that ash settled layer by layer, building thin, dark lines in the sediment. Each one was a record, a breath of eruption, a pause, then calm. Future eyes, millions of years later, would find them stacked like the pages of a burned diary, each grain holding the memory of a day when the sky rained dust. Inside that dust, clues were trapped. Tiny glass shards from volcanic explosions, so small they could float for weeks before drifting down. Crystals of olivine and feldspar, forged in the heart of molten rock, cooling into patterns that could tell time. Trace chemicals, sulfur, iron, mercury, sealed inside the ash like signatures. Long after forests turned to stone and bones to fossils, these flecks would remain, whispering of the fires that once darkened the air. But in the moment, none of that mattered. The creatures living through it could not read chemistry. They only knew that the air sometimes burned their throats, that rain tasted sharp, that the sunsets had turned copper and crimson. Even in calm, the light seemed wrong, softer, filtered through something invisible. And yet, life persisted. Seeds germinated in the ash, using its minerals to feed new shoots. Some plants adapted quickly, growing waxy leaves to shed the fine dust. Insects laid eggs in sheltered hollows, their young hatching in the short peace between eruptions. The forests changed color, tone, and rhythm, but they endured. To live on this planet meant to adjust, not in fear, but in faith that the ground would hold steady again. And so, between bursts of fire, the world rebuilt itself, again and again. The creatures went about their lives, believing each wave of ash to be the last, each strange dawn to mark the end of unrest. The idea that the earth could burn for centuries, even millennia, was beyond any living thing's imagination. As night fell after one such eruption, the ash clouds thinned and parted. The stars returned, faint but visible, their light flickering through the smoke. It was easy to think, in that quiet hour, that the danger had passed. The ponds reflected a pale moon once more. The wind was cool, carrying the smell of wet soot and damp bark. But under the stillness, heat continued to build. Deep fractures glowed faintly with molten light, unseen beneath the soil. The crust, once solid and silent, now hummed with tension. The air had grown used to the taste of ash, and the land was learning to live beneath its weight. The first ashfall would be remembered, not for its destruction, but for its deception. It was the storm that taught the world to trust in recovery. the calm that would make every eruption after feel, for a moment, survivable. In the rock, it would leave only a thin black band, a quiet bookmark in the story of a world that had only just begun to burn. The first fissures had spat fire like warnings, but now the planet exhaled in full. From cracks that stretched beyond the horizon, molten rock surged upward in waves, spilling across the land as rivers of fire. There was no explosion, no single cataclysmic burst, only an endless outpouring. Lava rose, thick and heavy, flowing not as a stream, but as a tide. It advanced slowly, consuming everything in its path with terrible patience. Forests hissed as the heat approached. The trees nearest the flow did not burn in flames, but boiled from within, their sap flashing to steam. Leaves curled into ash before they could fall. The ground itself darkened and blistered. Burrows filled with heat so intense that the creatures within never awoke. Where once there had been sound, the trill of insects, the croak of amphibians, the distant call of reptiles, now there was only the hiss and crack of fire meeting water, the deep roar of molten rock moving like a living thing. The rivers of lava spread for miles, sometimes hundreds, their surfaces glowing a furious orange, their edges crusting into black as they cooled. But beneath that thin skin, molten rock still moved, alive and unstoppable. It crept into valleys, swallowed lakes, and poured across plains that had stood unchanged for millennia. The world's familiar shapes began to soften. Hills melted into ridges, rivers vanished beneath glowing sheets that hardened into stone. The landscape became unrecognizable, a vast, rippling sea of fire turning solid before the eye. Each flow stacked upon the last, layer upon layer, until the land itself grew higher. These were not eruptions that ended in days or even years. They lasted for centuries, perhaps longer, each surge of lava building upon the memory of the one before. Over time, the molten layers cooled into thick, dark plateaus, stairways of basalt, stretching for hundreds of miles. To walk upon them in some distant future would be to tread across the frozen waves of Earth's greatest fire. The difference between these flood basalts and the explosive volcanoes of later ages was one of temperament, not intensity. There were no violent peaks launching clouds into the stratosphere, no sudden mountain-shattering blasts. This was steadier, quieter, more relentless, a pulse rather than a detonation. The lava poured from cracks in the earth like breath from a wounded lung, continuous and calm in its devastation. Between eruptions, the air would cool just enough for life to stir. Ash settled, rain fell, and hardy plants tried to reclaim the scorched ground. Ferns and mosses crept across the still warm rock, their roots searching for purchase in tiny fractures. Insects returned first, drawn to the warmth. Then amphibians found the edges of new ponds, where lava had dammed rivers. For a brief span, the world seemed to heal. Then, without warning, the earth would open again. Each new eruption built upon the last, thickening the crust like pages added to a story written in fire. The rhythm became familiar. Erupt, pause, erupt, a metronome that ticked through centuries. Every pulse reshaped the climate, filling the air with new waves of heat and gas. Sulfur and carbon dioxide drifted into the sky, mixing with steam to form clouds that glowed copper in the sunlight. Rain fell acidic and heavy, washing minerals from the new rock into the sea. Even the oceans began to change, their chemistry slowly rewritten by the planet's fever. For the creatures that lived through it, survival meant adaptation or retreat. Some fled to higher ground, though even mountains began to drown in molten stone. Others sought refuge underground or in distant wetlands where the heat did not reach. Yet no place was truly safe. The air shimmered with invisible poison. The soil radiated warmth from below. The world was being rewritten, not in one swift catastrophe, but in a series of relentless waves. And still, the fire flowed. From space, had there been an eye to see, Earth would have glowed like a dim star, streaked with veins of orange and red. The continents, dark and cracked, shimmered where lava spread in thin, gleaming ribbons. Even the oceans, reflecting the fiery sky, seemed to burn at their edges. In the midst of this destruction, beauty endured. At night, when the air cooled and the flows slowed, the land glowed softly, a vast field of embers stretching from horizon to horizon. Columns of steam rose where lava met water, forming ghostly towers that drifted and vanished. The air smelled of iron and rain. It was a world remade, terrible but alive. As centuries passed, the rhythm of eruption became the heartbeat of the planet. Lava buried old forests, then cooled, and new life crept over its blackened surface. Insects returned, then plants, then small reptiles, each generation adapting a little more to the heat and the change. The world learned to live between fires, never knowing peace for long. Each flow left behind clues for the future. Thin seams of glass, where molten rock cooled too quickly. Bubbles frozen in stone where gases once escaped. These would become the records geologists would one day read, the fingerprints of an Earth that burned without rest. For now, though, there was no one to read, only the slow conversation between fire and time. The lava moved onward, shaping mountains and burying valleys, leaving behind a surface smoother, darker, and harder than before. Beneath the glow of its own destruction, the planet was not dying. It was transforming, its skin thickening, its heart cooling, its pulse steady and strong. And though life above trembled and fled, deep below, the mantle still stirred. The plumes had not spent their fury. The cycle of eruption and pause, of fire and silence, would continue for ages yet. The earth had found its rhythm, a slow, burning breath, and it would not stop until the world had been remade. At first, it was the light that changed. The sun, once golden and clear, began to fade behind a veil that never seemed to lift. Ash and aerosols rose from the endless rivers of fire, caught by upper winds that carried them far beyond the reach of any eruption. The sky thickened with dust and droplets, a copper haze that swallowed distance and softened every edge. Days no longer felt like days. The sun climbed weakly, pale as a coin, and at noon its light could scarcely cast a shadow. When the wind blew, it carried the faint scent of brimstone and damp stone. Fine particles drifted down like gray snow, settling on the blackened plateaus and the few green places that remained. The world was wrapped in a twilight that never quite ended, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. At first, the change brought cold. Though the ground still radiated warmth from the recent lava flows, the air above began to cool. Sunlight struggled to pierce the copper sky, and the planet's fever paused. Nights grew sharper. Frost spread across the edges of ash-coated leaves. In the mornings, the breath of living things hung like ghosts in the still air, curling in slow spirals before fading into the haze. It was a strange contrast, a frozen calm in the wake of fire. The chills seeped into every part of the ecosystem. Rivers that had once steamed from nearby lava flows began to crust at their edges, thin layers of ice forming even where warmth lingered below. Ponds grew still and lifeless. The plants that had managed to regrow after each eruption now struggled with the dim light. Photosynthesis slowed. Leaves turned dull, their veins darkening as the energy they needed from the sun failed to reach them. For the animals that depended on those plants, scarcity came quickly. Herbivores wandered farther, seeking greenery that no longer grew. Predators followed, their hunts longer and harder. The familiar rhythm of feeding and resting broke apart. Life on the surface was caught between extremes, too hot when the lava came, too cold when the sky refused to clear. And yet, deep in the atmosphere, another transformation had begun. The same eruptions that had dimmed the sunlight were releasing invisible gases. Carbon dioxide, methane, and sulfur compounds, in staggering amounts. The ash and aerosols cooled the world for a time, but they also acted like messengers, carrying with them the seeds of the next great shift. These gases drifted and mixed, building a veil not of ash, but of heat. When the particles finally fell from the sky, the sunlight returned, weak but brighter. The frost melted, the air softened, and for a brief moment, the survivors must have thought the worst was over. But the warmth that followed did not behave like the warmth of ordinary days. It grew slowly, steadily, without pause. The planet was breathing differently now. The greenhouse gases trapped heat that could no longer escape into space. Each new eruption added another layer to the invisible blanket, and as the centuries turned, the balance tipped. The once cooling haze thinned, and the copper skies gave way to a deeper hue, one heavy with humidity and warmth. The air thickened, the seas began to steam, and the planet entered a fever that would last far longer than the chill that preceded it. It was a paradox of fire and frost, a world that could burn and freeze in the same breath. The creatures caught in this cycle had no name for what was happening, no way to understand that the same forces darkening their skies were also rewriting the chemistry of their air. They simply endured, each generation facing a climate slightly different from the one before, the change too gradual to flee, too vast to fight. In this half-light world, colors changed. Sunsets bled red and violet through the haze, painting the sky in bruised tones. Even the stars were altered, dimmed behind drifting veils of ash. Nights grew eerie, not fully dark, but glowing faintly as though the sky itself retained the memory of fire. When rain came, it fell cold and sour. Drops hissed where they touched the still warm ground, leaving pale streaks on the new basalt. Each storm washed minerals from the sky to the sea, feeding chemical reactions that would alter the oceans for eons. On land, the rain etched fine lines into the hardened lava, carving the first fragile beginnings of new rivers. The rhythm of the planet continued, fire below, frost above, warmth returning in waves. The creatures that survived learned to live in intervals, resting through the dim years, thriving briefly when the light returned. Their bones, buried in ash, would one day tell the story of endurance written in alternating bands of soot and clay. And through it all, the copper skies remained, sometimes thin and luminous, sometimes thick and suffocating, but always there. They became the ceiling of this long, burning age, the veil between the world below and the stars above. If one could have stood there then, beneath that strange, red-tinged light, it would have felt like standing inside a sunset that never ended. Beautiful, terrible, and eternal. Frost glittering on black stone in the morning, the air trembling with warmth by nightfall. Breath visible even in heat, clouds forming from the ghosts of every exhalation. The earth was teaching itself a new balance, one forged in contradiction. A planet that could freeze and burn, suffocate and breathe, die and begin again. The skies of copper were its canvas, and upon them, the story of fire and air was being written in light. one dim day at a time. The cold that had once blanketed the world retreated so gradually that few would have recognized the moment it ended. Frost melted from the ash-darkened leaves, and rivers once bound by ice began to move again. Slow at first, then faster, carrying silt and soot downstream. The skies, though still tinted copper, cleared enough for sunlight to press through with new strength. It felt like a return to life. But the light that came back was not the same. It carried weight, a heaviness that clung to the air and settled in the lungs. The planet had entered its long fever. Carbon dioxide filled the atmosphere in amounts unseen since the earliest days of life. Each eruption had breathed it upward, a slow exhalation from the planet's molten heart. At first, the gas had mingled harmlessly with the ash, lost among heavier particles that reflected sunlight. But as the ash fell and the skies thinned, the gases remained, invisible and patient. They wrapped the earth in a blanket that no wind could lift. Days grew warmer, nights refused to cool, and the world began to glow from within, a slow, smoldering warmth that seeped into soil, water, and bone. Seasons blurred. What had once been the rhythm of rain and rest, of growth and withering, stretched into unbroken warmth. Forests that had barely survived the frost now faced the opposite trial. Leaves that had adapted to dim light began to shrivel under the relentless sun. Streams dried to trickles. The ground cracked where roots sought moisture that no longer came. Then, when clouds did form, they came in furious bursts, deluges that carved the land and then vanished again, leaving steam rising from the blackened earth. The oceans, vast and enduring, bore the weight of the change first. They drank deeply from the sky, pulling carbon dioxide into their depths. At first, this seemed to steady things. The seas absorbed what the air could not hold, their waters thickening with dissolved carbon, their surface cooling for a time. But every absorption came with a cost. The chemistry of the ocean changed. Tiny shells, once made of calcium, began to dissolve more easily. Reefs weakened. The creatures that built them, the architects of marine life, struggled to grow in the newly sour seas. Microscopic life shifted in composition, and the balance that had once made the ocean fertile began to tilt. On land, feedbacks unfolded with quiet inevitability. The warming dried out peatlands, ancient, spongy soils rich in carbon from ages past. As they baked in the heat, they released that carbon back into the air, fueling the same fires that had created them. Forests burned, sometimes smoldering underground, where roots once clung to damp soil. Each fire released more carbon dioxide, feeding the very warmth that had sparked it. The cycle was simple, merciless, and self-sustaining. In the lowlands, drought ruled. In the highlands, storms raged. The air could now hold more moisture, and when it released that burden, it did so violently. Lightning split the copper clouds, igniting what little vegetation remained. Rain fell in torrents that stripped the land bare, leaving gullies where once there had been meadows. And through it all, the heat endured. The nights were the strangest change of all. In older times, darkness brought relief, the quiet cooling that allowed creatures to rest, to breathe. But now the warmth lingered even under starlight. The ground radiated heat long after sunset, and mist no longer formed in the early hours. It was as if the world had forgotten how to exhale. Life adapted, but slowly, awkwardly. Plants grew smaller, their leaves thicker, to conserve water. Some turned waxy. Others shed their leaves entirely in long dormancy. Animals that once moved by day became nocturnal, though the nights offered little respite. The survivors were the ones who could change the fastest, not the strongest, but the most flexible. Evolution, that quiet clockwork of trial and error, began to spin faster under the stress. The transformation was not violent, not in the way of explosions or floods. It was persistent. It was the kind of change that crept, reshaping the world while it still seemed familiar. A traveler might have walked through the same valley 1,000 years apart and seen only hints. A new species of fern, a thinner river, a thicker haze in the air. Small signs of a world tipping toward another state. And that was the truth of it. The tipping had already happened. The line between weather and climate, between passing hardship and permanent change, had been crossed quietly, somewhere between one eruption and the next. The planet had set its trap long ago in the gases and rocks deep below, and now it had sprung shut above. The greenhouse grip was invisible but absolute. It held the Earth in its grasp, reshaping every system from sky to sea. Each sunrise brought not renewal, but accumulation. More heat, more pressure, more consequence. The balance that had defined life for millions of years was gone, replaced by a new equilibrium written in warmth. And yet, even as the world sweltered, there was still beauty. The air shimmered with light, the seas glowed turquoise where plankton bloomed in strange abundance, and the twilight carried a golden hue that turned every horizon to molten glass. The planet was alive, restless, radiant. It was remaking itself once more, and life, stubborn, inventive life, was finding ways to follow. The great fever had begun, and it would not break for 1,000,000 years. The oceans had always been the planet's quiet regulators, its deep, slow lungs that inhaled the sky and exhaled balance. For millions of years, they had absorbed the planet's excess heat, its carbon, its tremors. They had carried the whispers of rivers and the dust of continents, dissolving all into a steady rhythm of life. But now, the heat had reached them in full, and that rhythm began to falter. It started subtly, like a fever in a body that did not yet know it was sick. Surface waters warmed first, shimmering beneath the copper skies. The waves looked the same, their crests still catching sunlight in brief flashes of silver. To the eye, the seas were eternal. But beneath that surface glitter, something was shifting. The warmth seeped downward, heavy and patient, spreading through the layers of the ocean like dye through still water. Normally, the sea moves in constant conversation, cold water rising from the depths to meet the warm, nutrient-rich currents flowing down from the surface. That motion feeds the plankton, the corals, and the great migrations of creatures that depend on the ocean's endless mixing. But as the surface heated, it grew lighter, less willing to sink. The deep, cold layers below stayed dense and still. The water column began to separate, like oil and vinegar refusing to blend. At first, this quieting went unnoticed. The seas still rippled, storms still churned their uppermost skin, and sunlight still danced across their faces. Yet below the reach of light, the water grew stagnant. Oxygen levels began to fall. The marine snow, a slow rain of dead plankton, shells, and organic dust, continued to drift downward, as it always had. But now it settled in waters that no longer carried the breath of life. Without the cool upwelling to stir it, the deep ocean began to suffocate. Creatures accustomed to those rising currents, fish, ammonites, tiny filter feeders, searched for the cold they depended on, but it was gone. They rose toward the surface and found only warmth that burned their gills and dulled their movements. Others sank lower, fleeing the heat, only to find silence in the dark, oxygen-starved depths. The ocean was becoming layered in death, a living top, a dying middle, and a bottom turning to rot. Coral ancestors, fragile architects of shallow seas, began to bleach. Their symbiotic partners, the microscopic algae that fed them, could no longer survive in the heat. One by one, the reefs dimmed, their colors fading from gold and violet to bone white. The structures they had built over centuries crumbled slowly, collapsing into pale rubble that sank and vanished into the murk. Where there had once been gardens teeming with life, now there was only stillness. Meanwhile, the chemistry of the sea was changing. The same gases warming the air were dissolving into the water, carbon dioxide mixing with hydrogen to form acid. It was a subtle transformation, invisible yet profound. Shell builders, tiny crustaceans, plankton, mollusks, began to falter. The minerals they drew from the sea to build their homes were dissolving faster than they could replace them. Their shells grew thinner, more fragile, until even the gentle currents broke them apart. The ocean's architecture was unraveling, molecule by molecule. The seas are the planet's lungs, drawing in carbon, exhaling oxygen, keeping the balance between fire and breath. But now, those lungs were failing. The surface still exchanged air with the sky, but the deep waters, the true reservoirs of life, had gone quiet. The ocean's breathing slowed, each layer of warmth above pressed heavier on the layers below. And with every passing century, less oxygen reached the depths. The silence spread outward, an invisible suffocation expanding beneath the calm surface. If one could have stood at the edge of the ancient coastline, it might have seemed beautiful still. The sun would rise, and the sea would glitter as it always had. Waves would break in rhythm, and seabirds, the early cousins of flight, might skim the air above, their cries echoing over the water. But beneath them, entire ecosystems were collapsing. The shimmer was an illusion, a mask for the quieting heartbeat of the ocean. In the shallows, tides carried the last traces of dying reefs to shore. Fragments of coral mixed with volcanic ash, coating beaches in pale dust. In the deeper zones, methane began to leak from the sediments, a chemical sigh from organisms breaking down in oxygen-starved waters. Each bubble that rose carried with it more heat, more imbalance, feeding the fever that gripped the world. The change was slow, measured in centuries, but it was relentless. Once the currents stopped moving, they were hard to restart. The planet's circulatory system, the endless churning of warm and cold, of life and decay, was locked in paralysis. Even as new lava fields cooled on land, the seas beneath the same sky grew lifeless and strange. From above, everything still shimmered. The sunlight that broke through the thinning haze turned the water to copper glass. It was almost serene, a world reflecting its own fire. But if you listened closely, if you could translate silence into sound, you might have heard it. The fading rhythm of an ocean losing its breath. The hush that comes when a giant world forgets, for a while, how to breathe. The oceans had always been the Earth's lungs, their slow exchange of gases keeping the world alive. But now, those lungs were failing. The heat that had seeped into the seas did more than still the currents. It began to rob the water of its breath. Warm water cannot hold as much oxygen as cold. And as the surface thickened with heat, the invisible exchange between air and sea faltered. The deeper layers, already stagnant, became tombs. What began as silence spread outward and downward, a creeping suffocation that no creature could outrun. At first, only the deepest trenches felt the change. There, in the blackness below light's reach, oxygen had always been scarce. Life in those depths was slow, adapted to stillness. But now, the suffocation was rising. an invisible tide moving toward the surface. The deep currents that once carried cool, oxygen-rich water upward were gone. The last of the old circulation had stalled, leaving the ocean stratified like a layered drink. Warm and bright on top, dark and breathless below. The boundary between life and death sharpened. Above it, fish still swam, plankton still drifted, and predators still hunted. But below, the water had turned deadly. Anything that sank beneath the threshold did not return. In the gloom, a new kind of life began to flourish. Sulfur bacteria, ancient chemists of the microbial world. They bloomed in vast clouds, feeding on the decaying bodies of creatures that had fallen into the deep. To them, the absence of oxygen was not a curse, but a feast. As they spread, they released gases that stung and burned. Hydrogen sulfide, sharp and sour, rising toward the surface. The color of the sea began to change. Layers that had once glowed blue now shimmered green, then yellow, then an eerie, sickly pink. The smell of sulfur drifted across coastlines, warning of the rot below. On the seafloor, the darkness grew thick. Where oxygen once allowed decay, now there was preservation. Dead plankton, fish, and fragments of plants settled into layers of black mud, rich with carbon, sealed by stagnation. Over time, these sediments would harden into black shale, pages of a geological diary written in carbon and ash. Each layer marked another chapter of the planet's suffocating fever, another breath the ocean could not take. Near the surface, life retreated to a thin band of water still touched by air. Shoals of fish pressed upward, crowding into the last livable zone, a narrow belt where oxygen could still dissolve from the wind above. It became a precarious raft, a sliver of safety between the dead water below and the blistering sunlight above. Here, everything gathered. Plankton, small fish, jelly-like drifters, and the predators that fed upon them. The great swimmers, the sleek hunters that once ruled the midwaters, wandered in confusion. They followed old currents that no longer flowed, chasing prey that could no longer breathe. Many suffocated in place, their bodies sinking slowly into the black layers below, joining the growing archive of extinction. The seas, once teeming with motion, became eerily still. Yet even in collapse, life adapted. The ocean's smallest inhabitants, microbes, larvae, and tiny crustaceans, began to change. In a world where oxygen was scarce, being small was an advantage. Tiny bodies need less air, less food, less energy. Evolution began to favor thrift over grandeur. This quiet shift, known later as the Lilliput effect, rewrote the script of survival. Great creatures vanished, but their smaller cousins endured, multiplying in the thin, breathy margins that remained. The transformation was gradual but absolute. The ocean that had once sung with the songs of whales and the chorus of fish now whispered only in bubbles and soft chemical sighs. The water shimmered strangely at dawn, the surface still reflecting the sky's copper light. But below it stretched a depthless black, a liquid night that absorbed all sound. Occasionally, storms would churn the surface, stirring oxygen downward for a time, teasing the sea with false renewal. For a few weeks, life would bloom, plankton turning the water green, small fish darting through their midst. But the balance never held. The warmth always returned, heavier and thicker than before, smothering everything beneath it. Each fall spring grew shorter than the last, and so the oceans entered their long quiet. The surface sparkled deceptively, alive with sunlight and wind, while beneath, the waters lay still as stone. From the shallows to the abyss, a gradient of breathlessness spread, invisible, yet relentless. It was as though the planet itself had drawn in. One long breath and forgotten how to let it go. But life, stubborn as ever, refused to end. It shrank, adapted, and waited. In tiny forms and hidden places, it learned to live on scraps of oxygen, on sulfur, on chemical traces of decay. The great web of life did not break. It simply rewove itself, tighter, smaller, quieter. In the deep, where the last light faded and the water turned black, the new world was already taking shape, a world of microbes and miniature survivors, living at the edge of endurance. Above them, the waves still rolled, shining copper in the sun, carrying the illusion of vitality. But beneath that shimmer, the ocean's heart had slowed, and the breath that once tied sea to sky had become a whisper fading into silence. The rain returned before the world was ready for it. After years of haze and heat, clouds began to gather again, heavy and restless. They swirled above the cooling lava fields, drawn by rising plumes of moisture and volcanic gas. The first drops fell thick and slow, hissing where they struck the warm rock. It should have been a blessing, the sky offering its relief after fire. But something was different. The air smelled sharp, metallic. When the rain touched the tongue, it burned. This was not the gentle water that once fed rivers and forests. It was rain reborn through chemistry, the sky's sorrow distilled into acid. As the volcanic gases rose, they carried sulfur dioxide and nitrogen compounds into the clouds. There, mingling with water vapor, they transformed into weak acids that fell back to earth as liquid sting. It wasn't strong enough to melt stone or sear bark, but over time, drop by drop, it etched away at the living world. In the forests that still clung to survival, leaves curled under the touch of this rain. Their waxy coating softened, allowing the acid to seep in. The droplets gathered at the tips, then fell in steady drips that stripped nutrients from the soil below. The earth began to leach away its strength. Minerals dissolved and washed downriver. Roots that had once drunk deeply now found only sour water, thin and bitter. The smell of wet ash lingered everywhere, a reminder that even renewal carried pain. Lakes and ponds fared no better. Their surfaces rippled with the falling rain, and the chemistry of their waters changed. The pH fell, just enough to unsettle the delicate balance that had returned after the ash clouds faded. Amphibians, the fragile bridge between land and water, suffered most. Their eggs, translucent, delicate spheres, clouded and broke apart, their jelly skins unable to protect against the acidity. The creatures that once sang in the rain now fell silent, their voices replaced by the soft hiss of drizzle on dying leaves. And yet, it was not total ruin. Nature rarely works in absolutes. Some plants, those already accustomed to volcanic soil, fared better. They had evolved to handle minerals that others found toxic, and their roots held firm in the sour ground. Ferns rose where trees fell. Lichens crept across rocks, their tiny bodies indifferent to the sting. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the ecosystem began to rearrange itself. The forest that emerged after the acid rains would not be the same as the one before, but it would live. The rocks themselves joined the quiet resistance. Beneath the burning rain, limestone cliffs began to dissolve, not destructively, but helpfully, releasing calcium that neutralized the acid in runoff streams. These natural buffers softened the blow, turning poisoned rivulets into milder waters downstream. Where the ground contained volcanic ash, the story was gentler still. The ash that had once suffocated forests was now feeding them. Rich in minerals like potassium and magnesium, it replenished what the rain had stripped away. Even in destruction, the planet was seeding its own recovery. Days blurred into weeks, and the rain became constant. It fell without thunder, a gray curtain that blurred horizon from sky. The world smelled of stone and sulfur, of wet basalt and steaming earth. Animals that remained moved carefully, sheltering under rocks or burrowing deeper into the soil where the acid could not reach. The surface world quieted, the sounds of life muffled beneath the ceaseless drizzle. But inside the soil, life stirred. Fungi spread their filaments through the damp ground, breaking down the fallen leaves into food. Microbes multiplied in the moist ash, digesting minerals and exhaling gases that would, in time, help new plants take root. The rain, cruel as it seemed, carried the ingredients of the next generation. Every drop that fell bore both damage and promise. In the shallows of the lakes, the water cleared again. The acidity began to fade where streams mixed with the neutralizing runoff from nearby cliffs. Tiny crustaceans reappeared, nibbling on the returning algae. A fragile equilibrium reasserted itself, delicate but determined. The air cleared after each storm, washed of ash and dust, only to darken again as new gases rose from distant fissures. It was a rhythm now: eruption, gas, rain, recovery. The same endless pattern of destruction and renewal that had governed the planet since the first fire. The creatures that survived had learned to bend with that rhythm, not fight it. They hid when the sky bit and emerged when it softened. If one were to walk through those forests, if forest could still be the word for them, one would find a landscape both scarred and healing. The bark of trees bore streaks where acid had carved through lichen. Pools shimmered faintly green with dissolved minerals. Yet among them, new shoots rose, their leaves tender and unscarred, reaching toward a dim but steady sun. The rain that bit was only one chapter in the earth's long recovery. It did not cleanse or punish, it transformed. Through it, the land learned its new chemistry, its soils shifted, and its rivers carried both poison and cure. The skies, though harsh, were still giving. And somewhere, between the hiss of droplets and the sigh of wind through ash, life whispered back, quiet, defiant, alive. The rains that once bit the ground eventually thinned and faded, leaving the air dry and trembling with heat. The clouds broke apart, their acid sting replaced by a scorching sun that glared through the copper haze. The world, still recovering from its fever, began to parch. Rivers shrank into narrow threads, ponds retreated into cracked basins, and what little vegetation had survived the ash and acid now found itself caught between thirst and flame. In the forests that had once thrived along the cooling lava fields, leaves turned brittle. The mosses that had spread in the damp, shadowed months curled into pale crusts. Every gust of wind lifted dust instead of moisture. The ground itself, layered with fallen branches and half-burnt debris from earlier eruptions, had become tinder. The next spark was inevitable. It came first as lightning, dry lightning thrown down from a restless sky that offered no rain. Bolts struck the treetops and raced through the canopy, leaping from trunk to trunk. Within moments, the forest roared to life. The flames moved quickly, hungry and chaotic, feeding on the resin-rich conifers and ferns that still clung to the valleys. Smoke rose in rolling pillars, turning day to twilight. The smell of burning sap carried for miles. Animals fled as they could. Some ran for the rivers, only to find them shrunken and hot. Others burrowed deep, pressed flat in the earth, where the heat was slower to reach. The smallest creatures, those that lived in the soil and leaf litter, were the first to perish, their homes turned to ember. Above ground, larger ones sprinted until the air itself betrayed them, thick with smoke and ash. The fire moved not as a line, but as a tide, curling, twisting, swallowing everything that stood still for too long. And yet, not all was destruction. Fire, for all its violence, has never been only a taker. It clears, it releases, it resets. When the first flames passed, when the smoke lifted and the wind carried away the last embers, the ground was left black but fertile. The ash that blanketed the soil held nutrients once locked inside the trees. Seeds that had waited through drought, some needing heat to crack open, began to stir. Sprouters and seeders alike pushed upward through the soot, drawn by instinct older than the forest itself. From the distance of deep time, the evidence of these fires would one day be read as if from a book. Tiny flecks of charcoal would settle into lakes and ponds, sinking gently to the bottom, preserved in layers of silt. Each black speck would mark an ancient inferno, an exclamation point in the slow grammar of the earth's recovery. Tree trunks would bear their own scars, dark rings of carbonized wood sealed beneath new growth, recording each burn and each rebirth. Even after the trees themselves fell and fossilized, those rings would remain, memories of flame written into the grain. In this age of fire, landscapes began to remember. The earth itself became a kind of storyteller, whispering in strata about cycles of burning and return. To a casual glance, it was devastation. Forests reduced to smoldering ruins, skies bruised with smoke. But beneath that ruin, the soil hummed with quiet renewal. Fungi spread first, feeding on the charred remains. Then came the green haze of seedlings, their roots exploring the still warm ground. Within a few years, the valleys were dotted again with life, different from before, yet born of the same ground. There was a rhythm to it. Burn, grow, burn again. In the pauses between infernos, the land would breathe and green over, only to ignite once more when drought returned. The new forests were patchier, more resilient, each species learning, in its own evolutionary language, how to live with fire. Some grew thick bark to resist heat. Others carried seeds designed to open only after flame. Even animals adapted. Burrowers dug deeper. Flyers nested farther from the ground. Life was not extinguished. It was rewritten in smoke and soot. When the wind rose after a burn, it carried the faint scent of minerals and rebirth. Rain, when it came again, turned the blackened ash into a gray paste that soaked into the earth. New rivers carved through the softened soil, carrying traces of charcoal to the lowlands, spreading fertility downstream. The scars of fire became the foundations of growth. To call fire a villain would be too simple. It was wild, yes, reckless and cruel in its reach. But it was also a gardener, pruning with heat, making room for new things to take root. The forests learned this long before we ever could, that destruction and renewal are not opposites, but partners in the endless conversation of life. When night finally returned after one of those long, burning days, the horizon still glowed faintly red. Smoke drifted low, curling through the valleys, softening the edges of the charred world. In the dark, the ground crackled as it cooled, and the stars flickered through the haze, faint but unbroken. The earth rested again, not in peace, but in rhythm, breathing through flame, exhaling into growth, preparing, as always, for what would come next. The fires faded, but the silence they left behind was heavier than smoke. Across the continents, the air no longer shimmered with heat. It hung instead with stillness, thick and strange. Forests that had once rebounded after every burn now stood thin and patchy. The trees that survived bore black scars up their trunks, and between them stretched wide clearings of ash and stone. The ground had lost its softness. Where roots had once held it firm, the soil now ran loose, slipping into rivers that no longer sang, but crawled, thick with silt. The world was breathing shallowly, its pulse slowed. In the oceans, the fever that had silenced the deep still lingered. Reefs lay quiet, pale ruins coated in fine dust. The fish that had once moved through them in dazzling swarms were gone. Only a few, smaller forms remained, drifting in uncertain waters. The predators that depended on them, sleek swimmers that had ruled for ages, grew hungry. Weak, then still, the currents that once stitched together the sea's life were threadbare, broken loops circling endlessly without connection. On land, it was much the same. The great herbivores, once steady grazers of ferns and conifers, found little left to eat. Their bones became markers across the plains, bleached in the unrelenting sun. Scavengers followed until even they had nothing left to find. Insects, the quiet keepers of decay and renewal, were fewer too. Their absence made the forests eerily clean. Leaves fell and lay untouched, piling into dry drifts that the next fire would claim. The songs of life had grown faint. Fewer wings in the air, fewer calls in the dusk. What was happening was not a single moment, but a slow unraveling. The web of life had frayed strand by strand until it could no longer hold. Ecosystems are stories, intricate and interwoven. And when enough of the main characters vanish, the rest lose their lines. The plants that depended on animals for pollination produced fewer seeds. The animals that depended on those plants starved. Rivers ran clearer of fish, but cloudier with sediment. Each loss echoed into another, rippling outward until even the smallest ponds and the highest ridges felt the change. Yet extinction, for all its sorrow, is never absolute silence. There were survivors, though they were few and humble. Small creatures found niches where the world's chaos could not easily reach. Some hid in burrows deep underground, where the air stayed cool and moist. Others clung to the edges of lakes, feeding on algae that still thrived in the dim light. In the forests, pockets of green endured, valleys protected from the worst of the droughts, where streams still trickled and moss still held the earth together. Life had shrunk, but it had not vanished. The specialists were the first to go. Creatures too finely tuned to one food, one climate, one rhythm. They were the masterpieces of stability, perfect for the world that had been, helpless in the world that was. But the generalists, the ones that could eat many things, live in many places, and wait through hardship, they endured. Evolution had taught them patience, and patience became their shield. The emptiness that followed was profound. The forests grew quieter each year, their canopies no longer rustling with constant motion. Rivers widened without roots to hold their banks, carrying earth into the sea. When it rained, the water ran red with sediment, washing away what little life remained in the shallows. On distant coasts, waves broke over bare rock where coral reefs had once flourished. The planet seemed to have paused, not dead, but resting after some great exhaustion. There was grief in this stillness, but also space. In every vacancy left behind, the world began to draw new breath. Seeds from surviving plants rode the wind to untouched valleys. Microbes, ever the first to adapt, spread into new territories, breaking down what the fires and floods had left. Life was already rewriting itself, rearranging the pieces of what had been into forms that could endure what was to come. From the vantage of deep time, this would one day be called the Great Dying, a threshold between two worlds. To those who lived through it, it was simply change beyond understanding. The disappearance of the familiar, the quieting of voices that had always filled the air. But extinction, as it has always been, was not the end of life. Only the end of one arrangement of it. In the shadows of cliffs, beneath stones still warm from the sun, tiny hearts continued to beat. They were the echoes of a world that refused to surrender, the keepers of possibility. The earth was wounded, scarred, and strange, but its spark remained, small, persistent, and ready. From these hidden survivors, in their shelters of soil and silence, the next story would one day begin. The world after the dying was hushed. Mountains stood like sentinels over lands scoured clean, and rivers crawled sluggishly through channels cut deep by floods. Forests had thinned to scattered groves, and the air no longer carried the constant drone of insects or the chatter of birds. Yet beneath the stillness, in cracks and corners, something moved. The earth, though broken, had not stopped breathing. Its pulse lingered faintly in places forgotten by catastrophe, places where the ruin could not quite reach. These sanctuaries were not grand. They were not lush or golden or vibrant. They were small, stubborn, and unremarkable, refugia, as the scientists of a far future would name them. Springs bubbled up through beds of alkaline rock, neutralizing the acid rains that still sometimes fell. In their clear waters, mosses unfurled like cautious green ribbons. Caves, dark and damp, held pockets of steady air where no frost nor fire intruded. On north-facing slopes, where the sun struck less fiercely, scraps of vegetation endured, ferns curling close to the soil, their fronds dim but alive. Here, life clung on in miniature. The giants of the old world, the towering reptiles, the sprawling forests, were gone. In their place, smaller forms had taken root. Tiny amphibians hid beneath stones, slick with condensation. Insects, half the size of their ancestors, flitted between low shrubs, feeding on whatever pollen or decay remained. Even among plants, the change was clear. The trees that had once stretched toward the heavens were replaced by low, woody bushes with thick skins and narrow leaves designed to hoard water and resist heat. This was the Lilliput effect made manifest, a world downsized for endurance. Large bodies required too much, demanded too many calories, too much air, too much stability. But smallness was thrift, and thrift was survival. The creatures that made it through were those that lived lightly, those whose hearts beat slower, whose appetites were flexible, whose lives turned over quickly enough to adapt within a generation or two. In these hidden places, time itself seemed to slow. The great cycles of eruption and flood had quieted, leaving behind rhythms of dew and drought. Each morning began with thin light filtering through dust-laden skies. The air smelled faintly of minerals and ash. By midday, warmth returned, gentle now, filtered through layers of haze. Evenings brought coolness, mist pooling in valleys where moisture still lingered. It was not paradise, but it was enough. Somewhere beneath an overhang of rock, a small lizard stirred from its shelter. Its body, no longer than a finger, blended perfectly with the stone. It darted toward a patch of moss, its movements careful, efficient. Nearby, a cluster of fungi fed on what remained of fallen leaves, their filaments weaving unseen through the soil. Tiny crustaceans wriggled in the mud of a shrinking pool. Descendants of survivors from the poisoned seas, their lineage carried here by wind or chance. They fed on algae that clung to the water's edge, algae that themselves owed their lives to the thin rays of sunlight still managing to pierce the murky atmosphere. Each of these creatures lived at the edge of enough food, enough air, enough time between disasters to raise another generation. Their survival was not a triumph, but a persistence, a quiet defiance. Life had learned thriftiness. It no longer reached toward excess, but folded inward, conserving, waiting. The soil, though stripped of richness, began to knit itself back together. Fungi broke down the remnants of old roots, weaving networks that helped the new plants draw sustenance from the dust. Bacteria, invisible but innumerable, recycled carbon and nitrogen, restoring the chemistry of the ground grain by grain. These were the unseen healers of the planet, working in silence, patient as stone. In the highlands, rain still fell sometimes. Light, hesitant showers that beaded on leaves and trickled down into the hollows. When it came, every living thing seemed to pause and listen. The drops struck the earth like small blessings. The moss grew brighter, the insects stirred, and the soil released a faint scent of renewal. The promise that even now, the world was not finished. Across eons, these refuges would remain the lifeboats of evolution. From their tiny populations, future lineages would unfurl, new plants, new animals, each carrying in their genes the memory of hardship. They would inherit resilience, not as choice, but as necessity, written into the fabric of their being. And when the planet's fever finally broke, when skies cleared and the sun shone fully once more, they would be ready to step forward into a world remade. For now, though, the survivors waited. The earth was quiet enough for their hearts to be heard. The faint flutter of wings in a cavern, the whisper of a lizard's feet across stone, the pulse of roots in the dark. It was a fragile music, but it was music all the same. Life's candle burned low, its flames shielded by the curved hands of stone, water, and time. Trembling, flickering, but unextinguished. Beneath the silence of the wounded world, the smallest lives began to hum again. The giants had fallen, the forests that once towered like cathedrals now lay as charcoal ghosts, and the seas that had once shimmered with fish were still and heavy. But in the thin films that spread across the edges of puddles and the slick rocks of tidal flats, life was reorganizing itself, not with noise or motion, but with chemistry. Invisible to the eye, it stitched the broken cycles of the planet back together one molecule at a time. Along the coasts, where volcanic dust met seawater, mats of microbes began to bloom. They looked like nothing more than slime, soft layers of green, brown, and purple clinging to the sediment. But within them worked countless lives, each cell a laborer in a vast, unseen factory. The air above was thin and sour, the light dim and red shifted through lingering haze. Yet the bacteria thrived. Some fed on sunlight still strong enough to filter through the murk. Others drew energy from minerals, teasing sustenance out of iron, sulfur, and methane rising from the sea floor. It was here, in the quiet shallows, that the earth began its slow exhale. The microbes didn't rebuild the world in grandeur or speed. They simply endured. Layer by layer, they spread across shorelines, binding loose sediment into mats that wrinkled and folded as tides came and went. Over time, their colonies left faint patterns in the mud, fossilizing into rippled textures that future eyes would read as signatures of life's persistence. Stromatolite echoes returning after millions of years. Where oxygen had vanished from the deeper waters, other microbes took over. These preferred the dark and the stillness, feeding on the leftovers of decay. They transformed sulfur into gas that bubbled gently upward, leaving behind minerals of strange colors, yellows, greens, and blacks, painting the seabed like a slow, chemical sunrise. It was not beauty in the way forests had been beautiful, but it was alive, industrious, and essential. The planet, in its exhaustion, was being quietly tended by the smallest of its children. The world's cycles, broken by heat and acid, began to turn again, awkwardly, unevenly, but undeniably. Carbon, once locked in the bones of forests and the shells of animals, was now exchanged by bacterial breath. Sulfur passed between rock and sea, transformed and reformed through microbial metabolism. Even nitrogen, scattered by the great fires, was gathered again, converted into forms that could feed the green things that would someday return. In the absence of grandeur, there was governance, an invisible order keeping the world from slipping into true silence. If you had stood by one of those shorelines, the air would have smelled faintly of eggs and iron. The water would have shimmered strangely, iridescent with thin microbial films that caught the weak sunlight. Beneath the surface, currents of color shifted. Emerald, ochre, violet, each a sign of a different bacterial community at work. Tiny bubbles would rise, bursting with soft hisses, releasing gases that would drift upward to mingle with the recovering sky. This was life at its most patient, its most elemental, the quiet hum of the planet breathing through chemistry rather than motion. In this new order, size no longer mattered. The great experiment of large bodies, intricate skeletons, and ambitious forms had paused. Now, the torch had passed to the invisible multitudes. Their lives were short but relentless. They divided, spread, and adapted to every niche the crisis had left open. Each species found its rhythm in the planet's fractured music, one feeding on the waste of another, one producing what the next required. Together, they formed a living web more resilient than anything that had existed before. This microbial renaissance was not something the Earth celebrated with thunder or flame. It was a murmur beneath the silence, a lullaby for a planet in convalescence. Every microbe that turned sulfur into stone or carbon into gas was part of a slow healing, reweaving the fabric of balance molecule by molecule. What had seemed like collapse was, in truth, recomposition, a rearrangement of matter, a rediscovery of equilibrium. It is easy to think of life as something fragile, dependent on light and movement, on heartbeats and eyes and leaves. But here, in this dim epoch of recovery, life proved otherwise. It could survive without forests or fins, without wings or flowers. It could thrive in darkness, feed on stone, and rebuild a world that seemed beyond repair. The Earth had learned thrift and patience. The microbes were its bookkeepers, steady hands recording every exchange of energy, every breath of gas, every atom set free or bound again. They worked without rest, without hurry, without hope or despair. And in their ceaseless, quiet labor, they prepared the soil and the sea for the next chapter. Above them, the wind carried dust. The sky was pale and weary. But beneath, in the mud and shallows, life whispered, "Not yet done, not yet gone." The hum continued, faint, persistent, eternal. The year began with a dimming, not the gentle fade of winter as it once had been, but a sudden hush in the light, a veil of ash drawn across the sky by a fresh pulse from the fissures. Morning arrived late and thin. Frost found its way into places it had not touched in years, tracing delicate filigree across charcoal logs and the tight buds of stubborn shrubs. Breath hung in the air even at midday. The ground rang hard underfoot, and the ponds wore brittle skins that spidered with cracks when a bird skimmed low. Creatures slowed, not by choice, but by the insistence of cold. Muscles that had learned to endure heat now remembered the small economy of stillness. By the second month, the ash thinned, but the chill held, lingering like a guest who cannot decide to leave. Snow fell in a world that had forgotten how to wear it, powdering black basalt steppes and settling in the shadowed creases of new valleys. The flakes carried faint chemistry, a sting softened by distance and time. In the caves and north-facing hollows, survivors drew tighter into their shelters. Small lizards lowered their heartbeats. Insects halted midway through transformation and waited in patient glass. The sky stayed a pewter gray, and the sun, when it appeared, seemed older, small as a coin pressed against cloud. Then came the turn. A wind from lower latitudes, heavy with memory of warmth, lifted the last films of haze. The world brightened in a day, as if a lid had been lifted. Meltwater threaded the slopes, urgent and silver, and every channel became a river. The hillsides, stitched poorly by new roots, let go. Slabs of wet earth slid in slow-motion avalanches, and gullies drew themselves in hours where none had been. Floods braided and unbraided, cutting quick canyons, delivering silt to plains that had been hungry for it. Along the fresh banks, microbial sheen flared emerald, and hardy shoots unscrolled into the light. For a brief stretch, the air tasted clean. The reprieve was a week long, 10 days at most. Then the heat arrived with no negotiation. The sky deepened to a metallic blue, and the ground drank sunlight until it hummed. Streams shrank into bright threads, puddles became mirrors, then salt-laced stamps in clay. The new canyons exhaled dust. Leaves toughened, narrow and waxed. Animals learned the geometry of shade, the angle of a rock at noon, the exact hour a ledge would cast a usable shadow. Everything alive moved on a knife edge, balancing effort and rest by instinct honed in crisis. By midsummer, the greenhouse breath pressed down like a hand. Nights no longer cooled in the old way. Darkness arrived without relief. Insects traded wing beats for groundwork, chewing and burrowing to save water. Small mammals shifted from day to dusk to night and back again, improvising to a rhythm that refused to settle. Breeding became an art of timing. A chorus of amphibians rose in one valley after a stray storm. Eggs set in trembling strings along a temporary pool, then fell silent 2 days later when the pool baked to glass. Those that survived learned the new arithmetic. Breed on the hour that rain meets moonlight, or not at all. Migration maps redrew themselves with each season. Lines that once ran north to south now wove like cursive between islands of tolerable weather. A spring-fed seep here, a wind-scoured pass there. Flyers tested heights, skimming layers where the air held a little more oxygen or a little less heat. Ground swimmers traced river shadows, traveling by the lace of moisture at their edges. The old routes were overlaid by new ones so quickly that memory itself had to adapt. Parents taught what they could. Offspring corrected in the first year what tradition had gotten wrong. Late summer turned sullen. Fires returned, not as walls, but as flickers that stitched across slopes, kindled by lightning from dry storms that boomed without rain. Charcoal flecked the lakes, drifting like black snow, each flake a punctuation mark falling into the year's layered sentence. After each burn, a gray-green fuzz took hold. Fern and moss, first responders in ash. Soil organisms moved in beneath, a silent workforce rearranging grains and gases into something roots could trust. The land wore its scars openly and learned to use them. Autumn did not announce itself so much as be discovered in small mercies. A run of cooler nights strung together like beads. Dew gathered on the edges of basalt and held until noon. A pocket of fog pooled in a basin where streams converged. In those hours, creatures hurried, not panicked, simply efficient, to eat, mate, molt, and mend. Seeds slipped from their casings with the first breeze and sailed into cracks still warm from yesterday's sun. The calendar no longer depended on date or constellation, but on the feel of the air at the back of the throat, the smell of iron or resin or rain. Then, as if remembering, the planet inhaled another plume. Light dulled again, ash returned, a finer veil this time, softening the edges of stones and muting sound. A brief winter tightened across the land, sharp and spectral. Ponds skimmed over, breath became visible again. The cycle completed, not a circle but a spiral, each turn similar yet changed. New gullies here, a fresh terrace there, a colony shifted a valley over. Weather had ceased to be scenery. It was a character with moods and rules, exacting and instructive, demanding improvisation from every living thing. Under that tutelage, life practiced. Muscles learned 2 sets of reflexes, one for frost, one for flame. Eggs matured faster when clouds held, slower when heat pressed. Roots broadened their beds, shallow for sudden rain, deep for drought. Even patience evolved, the knack of waiting in stillness, then exploding into motion in the single hour when all signals aligned. A year on the knife edge ended where it began, with the sky considering itself, with a world held between chills and fever. It was not a comfortable year. It was not kind, but it was a teacher, and its lessons stuck. In the pauses between pulses, a new competence gathered. Not confidence exactly, but a practiced grace. The next year would bring its own rehearsals. The choir of survivors would be ready, scripts revised, breath steady, eyes on the weather as one watches a lead actor step to the front of the stage and bow. The heat that once tore the world apart had finally gone still. The great rivers of fire, which had flowed for centuries, froze mid-motion into black glass. What had been molten fury hardened into order, not chaos, but pattern. The land remade itself in geometry. From above, the cooled lava spread in vast, dark sheets, broken by the regular rhythm of cracks that formed as it cooled. They were not random. They were music, the earth's cooling song etched into stone. Columns rose in clusters like organ pipes, each hexagon perfect where molten rock had shrunk and split as it yielded to the chill of air and time. To walk across that new terrain was to step into a cathedral built by fire. The air still smelled faintly of minerals and ozone, as if the eruption's breath had not yet faded. The surfaces were smooth in some places, rippled in others, the frozen traces of currents that had once moved faster than any river. In the low light of dawn, the basalt gleamed faintly, glassy and black, reflecting the dim copper of the sun like a mirror tarnished by smoke. Footsteps rang against it, not muffled, as they might on soil, but sharp and echoing. The ground felt alive beneath the feet, young and resonant, as though it had only just learned to be solid. Where the lava had pooled deepest, it cooled slowest, forming immense terraces, step-like plateaus that rose and fell across the horizon. Later, when rains returned, they would guide rivers that carved along those steps, tracing the lines left by the planet's molten pulse. For now, the plateaus stood bare, windswept and clean, their edges sheer. In the distance, mist pooled in hollows where heat still rose faintly from the depths, the Earth's slow exhalation continuing under its crust. The newborn rock was sterile, but not for long. Life, patient and opportunistic, had already begun its quiet invasion. Spores drifted on the wind, invisible scouts carried from older, luckier lands. They landed on the glassy plains and lodged in microscopic cracks, where moisture condensed from night air. There, the first lichens took hold. Fragile partnerships of fungus and algae that could make a living from nothing more than sunlight, dust, and stone. Their touch began the first act of transformation. They exhaled weak acids, breaking down the basalt molecule by molecule, turning glass to grit, grit to the first hints of soil. In the shaded creases between the columns, moss followed. Its soft green spread like breath over black rock, capturing dew and sheltering bacteria beneath its fuzz. Where the moss thickened, tiny roots began to find purchase, not yet trees, but small shrubs, ancestors of future forests. They were tough, their seeds wrapped in armor against wind and drought, their leaves thick and silvery to hold what little water the sky offered. Between them, early ferns uncoiled, unfazed by heat or acid, their fronds catching the weak sunlight that filtered through the haze. Every rainfall rode upon the land. Droplets struck the basalt with a musical ring, beating and rolling down into fine cracks, carrying with them fragments of ash and dust. In each wet streak, a little chemistry took place. Minerals dissolved, ions exchanged, tiny building blocks released into waiting soil. Over seasons, these reactions softened the sharpness of the rock's edges, turning the surface matte. Streams appeared in miniature, tracing channels through the black crust, and where they pooled, they left behind glimmering films of clay, the beginnings of fertile ground. As rivers grew, they followed the weaknesses in the basalt, finding joints and seams where cooling had fractured the stone. There they dug deep, etching valleys and gorges that would one day guide forests and herds. The geometry of the cooling rock determined the future geography. Every hexagon, every column, every step a blueprint for what would come. The world was building its scaffolding anew. At night, under a faintly recovering sky, the basalt shone like obsidian. Starlight caught in the fine cracks, making the land appear as though stitched with silver. The air still held the ghost of warmth, rising from fissures that glowed faintly red when the wind shifted. In the dark, the terrain felt both alien and intimate, a reminder that this planet, so often wounded, could also begin again from its own scars. With each sunrise, color returned. Where green met black, where moss pressed against glass, the world's first new pigments bloomed. Slow, subtle miracles of patience. A streak of orange lichen along a cliff face. A patch of soft gray where spores had taken hold on cooled columns. A single, hardy shrub standing in a crevice filled with dust and rain. The basalt was more than rock. It was memory solidified. Within it were trapped bubbles of the old atmosphere, shards of the eruption's last breath, tiny windows into the fire that once remade the earth. And above it, the first stirrings of the next age. Life creeping over the cooling bones of catastrophe. The land no longer smoked, but it still whispered, its fractures and folds singing the story of rebirth. It was a world stripped to its elements: rock, air, water, light. Yet from these few things, everything would return. The planet, once a field of fire, had become a library of beginnings. Every rock was a fresh page, and every rainfall wrote, soft, patient, and sure, the first words of a new chapter in the story of life. The land, newly hardened into its basalt bones, gave off a faint shimmer in the sun. Heat rose in soft waves, but the air that drifted above it was changing. Less the heavy, suffocating cloak it had been, more a fabric beginning to breathe again. It was still sharp with sulfur and metallic tang, still tinged with the ghosts of eruptions, but through it threaded something new. The faint, clean scent of oxygen, barely perceptible, but growing. The planet was beginning to talk to itself again through the chemistry of its sky. Above the horizon, the atmosphere looked layered, a pale bronze at the base where dust and vapor mingled, then fading to gold, then gray-blue at the edges of space. Each layer carried the memory of what the Earth had endured. There was sulfur dioxide, rising from the last smoldering vents and drifting in thin veils that turned sunlight to copper. There were halogens, released from volcanic ash, chewing at the delicate ozone that had only just begun to reform. And there was carbon dioxide, the quiet ruler of warmth, the invisible line on the planet's thermostat. The air had become a living negotiation. Volcanoes still spoke in bursts of gas, sending signals upward like punctuation marks in a long, slow argument. The oceans replied, breathing in what they could and giving back what they could not. Rocks and rain joined the conversation too, whispering at the edges, balancing, buffering, absorbing. It was not a peaceful dialogue, but it was alive, a chemistry that learned, corrected, and persisted. On the slopes of the new basalt, rain began to fall again with more frequency. The droplets, having stolen a little carbon dioxide from the air, carried it down to the rock. There, an ancient partnership resumed, one that had been interrupted by fire. Carbonic acid, mild and patient, reacted with the silicate minerals in the stone, pulling carbon out of the air and binding it into solid form. It was slow work, the kind that took tens of thousands of years to register. But time was exactly what the planet had in abundance. Each storm wore down a mountain by a fraction, carrying its dust to the sea, locking a little more carbon into sediment. The Earth was quietly beginning to cool itself. This is the silicate weathering thermostat, nature's most stubborn balancing act. When the air grows too thick with carbon, warmth accelerates rain, and rain scrubs the sky clean grain by grain. When the planet chills too much, dryness halts the wash, allowing carbon to build again. It is not a mechanism designed, but one discovered. A natural rhythm of dissolution and deposition, breath and pause. Even during the height of catastrophe, that rhythm had not stopped completely. Now, with the fires stilled and the rains returned, it grew steady once more. High above, halogen vapors slowly waned, their brief rebellion against ozone ending as they found new bonds in ash and dust. The sky's color shifted. The strange copper dusk of the volcanic age softened toward blue, though not yet the clear blue we know. It was a blue born through effort, the result of light scattering through air that had learned over and over how to heal itself. During the day, the sun's warmth was forgiving, filtered through a haze that no longer burned the skin. At night, the stars returned, faint at first, then sharper, reflected in shallow pools forming across the basalt plains. Those pools, still, mineral-rich and acidic, fizzed gently as carbonic gases met stone, feeding the invisible chemistry of renewal. Microbes thrived in them, turning carbon and sulfur into food, exhaling faint traces of oxygen into the twilight. The balance between stone and sky was no longer abstract. It was embodied in every droplet, every film of life, every gust of wind. As the seasons lengthened and the air cleared, the first breezes that felt like true weather swept across the land. They were cool in the mornings, warm by afternoon, not hostile, just alive. Dust lifted, mingled with spores, and settled again miles away. The atmosphere had become a highway for seeds and stories, carrying the beginnings of green into the far corners of the recovering world. The same gases that once choked the planet now became its architects. Carbon dioxide fed photosynthetic microbes, sulfur nourished bacterial mats, nitrogen re-entered the cycle of soil. Each molecule that had been a weapon of extinction was becoming a tool for growth. Slowly, imperceptibly, the chemistry of ruin was turning into the chemistry of life. And through it all, the earth exhaled with patience. The sky above, though still streaked with pale smog, began to thin in its sorrow. Light scattered differently now, brighter at the edges, softer near the ground. In this slow exchange between rock, rain, and air, a delicate truth was rewriting itself, that the planet is not fixed in its suffering. Even as it burns, it begins to heal. Every stone eroded, every drop that fell, every sigh of gas was a line in that long conversation. The air we breathe, or would one day breathe, was being composed anew, not in haste, but in harmony. The sky, for all its violence and change, was a cradle after all, one that rocked, corrected, and endured, teaching that even ruin can be rewritten in the language of balance. The darkness came softly this time, without fire or thunder. The last eruptions had quieted, but the sky, never fully at rest, gathered its veils again. Fine ash drifted upward from distant fissures and spread into high, invisible sheets that thickened week by week until even the brightest days dimmed to the color of old parchment. At dusk, the horizon melted into the air, and the boundary between earth and sky disappeared. When night finally came, it was not a clean shadow, but an absorption, a black so deep that it erased the idea of distance. The stars went first, one by one, swallowed until only the faint memory of their light remained. The world moved differently under such skies. The usual markers, sun, moon, constellation, vanished, leaving creatures to navigate by touch, scent, vibration, and memory. The air was heavy, not with heat this time, but with dust, a fine mineral snow that dulled every sound and softened every step. The ground beneath the ash gave a muted sigh when pressed, and footprints lingered longer than usual, small fossils of motion waiting for the next wind to erase them. In this muffled world, silence was never absolute. Somewhere far off, the earth still murmured, the slow rumble of magma shifting deep below. Closer by, small lives carried on their work in the dark. The scuttle of tiny legs across cooled stone, the whisper of wings adjusted against the weight of settling dust. Even the breeze had texture, dry, granular, brushing against the skin like silk laced with sand. Plants, too, had their ways of waiting. Seeds that had fallen months earlier, light, perfect spirals built for travel, lay buried beneath thin blankets of ash. To them, darkness was no enemy. It was instruction. They did not rot or break. They bided. Within their shells, chemistry slowed to a hum, life folded neatly into stillness. They would wait years if they had to, decades even, until the world brightened again. This patience, learned over eons of disruption, was their genius. The seeds knew the language of silence better than anything that breathed. Animals that had survived the fevered years learned new senses. Sight, once dominant, became unreliable. Eyes dulled, ears grew keener. Some creatures developed the habit of scent tracing, following the faint chemical trails left by mosses and microbes that clung to stone even when all else was still. Others learned to listen to echoes, mapping the shapes of their surroundings through clicks and calls, the way sound bounced off wet rock or hollow bark. In the absence of light, life turned inward, relying on touch and rhythm, on memory encoded not in sight, but in movement. When rare breaks appeared in the ash, the world revealed itself in ghostly gray. Trees, stripped of color, stood like statues in shallow fog. Lakes reflected no sky, only themselves, dark mirrors framed by soot. And yet, in those brief hours, when the veil thinned, the faintest glimmer of a sun returned, scattering light through dust so fine it shimmered like silver mist. Creatures stirred, sensing without understanding, and for a moment, the world remembered brightness. Then the clouds folded shut again, and all fell back into ink. The nights grew long, but not lifeless. Beneath the basalt cliffs, where fissures still exhaled warmth, colonies of microbes flourished in films of condensation. They fed on minerals, glowing faintly in places where their chemistry produced tiny sparks of phosphorescence. Those glows, subtle and greenish, were the closest thing to stars in this buried age, constellations drawn not across the heavens, but across stone, guiding the smallest wanderers through a land of shadow. In the deeper caves, where air held steady and sound carried like water, hibernating creatures stirred occasionally, not from hunger, but from instinct. The soft recalibration of heartbeats to match the planet's slower rhythm. Each pulse, each breath, was an act of quiet alignment. The Earth was teaching patience again, and everything living, from the largest survivor to the smallest bacterium, was learning to listen. When rain returned, it did so almost imperceptibly. A whisper on ash, a tapping so gentle it sounded imagined. The droplets merged into threads, carving faint lines through the gray dust, tracing the same old paths where rivers had once flowed. In the morning that followed, though the light was still dim, a hint of green showed at the edges of one of those runnels, a single moss strand uncoiling after years of sleep. That was how the world began to turn back toward color, not with a sunrise or thaw, but with one living thread reaching up into darkness, trusting that above the clouds, somewhere, light still existed. The nights would last centuries yet, their shadows deep and unbroken. But within them, life had mastered endurance. Seeds slept, hearts slowed, roots groped blindly toward moisture. In the absolute absence of stars, patience itself became the flame, invisible, steady, unquenchable. The world's breath had grown so faint it could hardly be heard, yet it persisted, and that persistence was enough. In time, the ash would thin, and the first true stars would pierce the veil once more. But until then, life waited, quietly, faithfully, in the long, dark music of nights without stars. When the darkness finally began to lift, the rains returned with new intent. They did not fall as before, gentle drizzles or soft curtains, but in heavy, pulsing storms that carried the smell of metal and clay. The rivers, swollen by months of stored heat, spilled across the young land in wild braids, dragging loose stones and silt through the valleys. Wherever the water lingered, it left behind stains of deep crimson. The iron in the soil, newly freed by weathering basalt and the breath of air returning to balance, oxidized in the wet warmth, painting the plains red. It was a color that spoke of change, a world no longer gray or black, but rusting into new life. The floodplains spread like open wounds that healed by brightening, their surfaces slick with iron mud that gleamed in sunlight when the clouds finally broke. On these flats, the story of loss and endurance was written again and again, not in words, but in bones. The rivers were impatient. They shifted courses each season, cutting new paths and abandoning old ones. In their bends, the bodies of creatures that had fallen, some drowned, others weakened by hunger or trapped by the sudden rise of water, collected in quiet eddies. The flow buried them gently in fine sediment, pressing them into the mud that would one day harden into stone. Most would vanish in time, returning to the soil without trace. But a few, by chance or chemistry, would persist. Fossilization, that slow alchemy of memory, began with such accidents. The bones that lay in water rich with minerals, calcium, silica, iron, absorbed those elements as their organic parts decayed. Little by little, The fragile lattice of bone was replaced by crystal, cell by cell, until what remained was no longer bone, but stone wearing its shape. The river, indifferent, continued its work above, layering fresh sediments, pressing history down grain by grain. Elsewhere, on higher ground, skeletons broke under the sun. Scavengers scattered them. Wind abraded them to powder. In time, even their shadows were erased. The land was selective in its remembering. It kept only fragments, jaws with teeth still set, a curve of rib, the impression of a leaf pressed flat against the clay. The rest became part of the color, part of the red dust that rose in every dry season and settled in the next rain. Across centuries, these floodplains shifted like pages being turned. Each layer of red mud sealed the one beneath it, preserving not just the bones, but the ripples of ancient water. The footprints of those who had crossed moments before the floods came, the delicate imprints of fern fronds and seed pods. The earth had found a new way to write, a diary composed not of ink or speech, but of pressure and patience. In one such layer, a small skeleton rested curled, its bones thin and hollow, the ribs arched inward, as if still protecting a vanished heart. Around it, the sediment held tiny shells from river invertebrates and grains of volcanic glass that sparkled faintly under sunlight. If you could have stood there then, you might have thought it no more than a shadow in mud. But as time marched on, the minerals seeped in, the waters retreated, and the story was sealed, a record waiting for eyes that would not exist for millions of years. Above ground, the living world continued to improvise. New plants grew on the floodplains, their roots digging into the red soil, drawing strength from the very minerals that once entombed the dead. When the rains came again, they washed down the remnants of these pioneers too, layering one story atop another. Life and death, sediment and time, all blurred into a single continuum, a quiet conversation between what endured and what dissolved. And far in the future, under a different sky, there would come hands, human hands, brushing sand from stone, coaxing form from rock. A jawbone here, a vertebra there, pieced together like a puzzle half-remembered. Those hands would lift the remains from their beds of iron dust and read them like scripture. Each bone would be a sentence, each layer a paragraph, each fossilized ripple a line of poetry about water and time. In that far-off age, the red beds would be known as archives of catastrophe and recovery. To the field geologists kneeling in the heat, the bones would tell of climates and extinctions, of rivers that had shifted 1,000 times, of a world that had burned and healed and burned again. They would see in the stone the faint trace of a heartbeat, the echo of life's insistence, that even in death, it leaves its mark. For now, the rivers continued their weaving. The floodplains glowed under the slant of evening light, their surfaces cracked and patterned like old skin. Beneath them, countless stories slept, bones becoming stone, stone becoming memory. The earth was keeping its diary as it always had, without haste, without sentiment, but with a fidelity that no living author could match. The ink was iron, the parchment clay, and every rainfall turned a new page. The red beds had long cooled to silence, but deep within them, messages slept, coded not in language, but in chemistry. To the creatures who lived and died there, the world had been only weather, hunger, and chance. But the stones, ever patient, had been taking notes. Every rainfall, every eruption, every drought left behind a trace, an adjustment in minerals, a subtle change in ratios. Time, with its unhurried hand, sealed these traces beneath layers of dust until the planet's memory became geologic. Millions of years later, long after the lava had hardened into cliffs and the rivers had carved new paths, the rocks still whispered their secrets to anyone who knew how to listen. It begins with the smallest of clues, a shift in carbon signature. When volcanoes fill the air with carbon dioxide, the balance between the two stable forms of carbon, the heavier and the lighter, tilts. Plants and plankton, taking in that carbon, record the imbalance in their tissues. When they die, those records sink, lock into mud, and harden into stone. To the untrained eye, it's just rock. To a geochemist, it's a chart of breathing, of photosynthesis and suffocation, of the planet's inhalations and exhalations through ages of fire and calm. Across those same layers, tiny spikes of mercury mark the pulse of eruptions. Each outburst of lava, each venting of gas, released mercury into the atmosphere, where it drifted and settled like invisible dust. In ancient sediments, those spikes rise sharply, then fade, exclamation marks punctuating the story of catastrophe. Between them, the background steadies, the world catching its breath again. Reading such a record feels less like studying the past and more like eavesdropping on the Earth's old heartbeat. Then there are the zircons. Tiny, clear crystals, no bigger than a grain of sand, but nearly immortal. Born in molten rock, they carry within them traces of uranium that decay into lead at a known, steady rate. By measuring that decay, we can know when each crystal formed. To the year, if patience and instruments allow. In their glittering lattices, these zircons hold timestamps from every chapter of the planet's story. Tiny clocks set running in magma and stopped only when the rock cooled enough to hold them still. Through them, we can look back across hundreds of millions of years and say not just that something happened, but when and how quickly and in what sequence. Taken together, the carbon, the mercury, the zircons, they form a kind of diary of the invisible. Where fossils show us bodies, these signals show us breath. They tell us how warm the air was, how deep the oceans mixed, how fast the rivers carried silt, how dark the skies became. A column of rock drilled from the crust is not just stone, it's a scroll. A vertical story written in isotopes and oxides, each millimeter a century of weather reports. When scientists unroll such a core and measure its chemistry, they can watch the sky itself change color through time. The pale blues of stability, the oranges of fever, the blacks of ash and silence. In one band of the record, mercury spikes align with a drop in carbon's light form, evidence of the great burning, a world gasping as forests turn to smoke. In another, the carbon ratio steadies again, suggesting the slow return of green, of photosynthesis, of oxygen. Still deeper, zircons from ancient lava mark the very moment the flood basalts began their march. The trigger, the match to the fuse. Each layer is a sentence, and together they read like a long confession, how the planet stumbled, choked, and finally adapted. It's humbling to imagine that such signals lie beneath our feet, stories invisible to sight or sound, but clear as music once translated. What feels to us like silence is full of data, a murmured tally of temperatures, acidities, gases, and rains. The stones do not exaggerate. They remember precisely. Even the tiniest grains of clay preserve isotopic fingerprints that match across continents, linking faraway lands into the same catastrophe. What happened in one volcanic province left echoes in seas half a world away. The rock record, when stitched together, turned separate tragedies into a single planetary narrative of fire and fever. In laboratories millions of years later, people will cradle slivers of those same red beds in gloved hands, dissolve them drop by drop in acid, and watch their chemistry reveal itself in color and curve. Machines will hum softly, translating ancient heat into numbers, numbers into graphs, graphs into stories. And through those quiet instruments, they'll hear the Earth's old voice again, the whisper of oceans losing breath, of air thickening, of forests vanishing, and of life returning in stubborn defiance. For now, though, the signals rest in darkness, encoded in iron and glass, waiting. The rocks are in no hurry. They have already seen whole ages rise and vanish. They will wait until we are ready to listen, until curious hands brush the dust away and coax meaning from their quiet complexity. The story is already there, etched deep in the crust, patient as memory itself, a story written not for us, but through us in the enduring language of stone. 1,000,000 years. The words slip easily from the tongue, as if they were just a larger version of 1,000 or 10,000. But in truth, 1,000,000 years is not a number at all. It's a rhythm, a pulse too slow for human senses, yet steady enough to shape worlds. To feel it, you have to let time stretch. You have to imagine the Earth breathing in units we can barely comprehend. It begins with a single forest. Trees rise, sway for centuries, and fall. Roots clutch stone until the stone weathers into soil. That soil, in turn, becomes the foundation for another generation. A single forest, growing, burning, and regrowing, 10,000 times over. With each cycle, ash enriches the ground, rivers carve new meanders, and creatures evolve in small, imperceptible increments. To live within that span would be like watching a heartbeat slowed to one pulse every 1,000 lifetimes. The lava that once poured across continents did not arrive in a single tantrum. It came in waves, each flow lasting months or years, each pause between them stretching for centuries. Imagine that, an eruption seen by your ancestors, then by your descendants 50 generations later, and still by theirs, the same fire, the same light bleeding across the horizon. Over time, those flows stacked higher than mountains, sheet upon sheet of cooled basalt, layering the planet's skin like armor. Each eruption was a single brushstroke. 1,000,000 years was the finished painting. Between eruptions, rain fell for centuries, chiseling the edges of each flow, carving rivers that began as threads and deepened into canyons. Those rivers carried away pieces of the new land, turning black rock to red soil grain by grain. From that dust, life returned. First moss, then shrubs, then forests again, each finding a moment of calm before the next pulse of fire. If you could stand still through it all, the world around you would seem to move like a tide, creation and destruction lapping against each other, one never fully winning. In the oceans, change followed its own tempo. Currents shifted slowly. Continents drifted a few centimeters a year, yet across the span of 1,000,000 years, those small motions rearranged entire climates. Mountains rose, their summits catching snow that had never fallen there before. Seas deepened, then shallowed again. What seemed eternal was never still. The Earth was a vast, patient clock, ticking not in seconds, but in epochs. Scientists today measure that passage through clues finer than dust. A lava flow, for instance, may cool in a matter of weeks, but the magnetic field it captures freezes a moment in planetary history. Stack 100,000 of those frozen moments, and you have a calendar longer than any civilization. Even the zircon crystals buried in ash hold within them the echoes of that immense duration. Atoms shifting, decaying, marking time in the most faithful way nature knows. But to say the world burned for 1,000,000 years is not to say it burned continuously. There were intervals of calm so long that generations of creatures lived and died believing the fire had gone forever. In those lulls, ecosystems rebuilt themselves. Evolution experimented, tentatively at first, then boldly. And just when stability seemed to take root, the earth below stirred again, reminding every living thing that peace was temporary. These were not random accidents. They were the rhythm of a planet resetting itself, the deep time equivalent of breathing out and in again. For us, a year is a cycle of light and dark, of growth and rest. For the planet, 1,000,000 years is a single exhalation, a sigh through rock and ocean. Within it, entire species rise, flourish, and vanish. Mountains bloom and erode. Rivers migrate across continents, carving letters of time into stone. The repetition is slow but relentless, and in its patience lies the secret of endurance. When we say, for 1,000,000 years, we do not speak of eternity. We speak of enough time for heat to become memory, for chaos to give birth to order, for ash to turn into soil. It's the time it takes for disaster to fade into geology, for wounds to fossilize into beauty. The lava cools, the rivers meander, the forests return, each phase building quietly upon the bones of what came before. If you could compress that span into a single heartbeat, the sound would be deep and resonant. The thrum of magma, the whisper of erosion, the sigh of life adapting yet again. That is what 1,000,000 years feels like. Not endless, but profoundly sufficient. Long enough to sculpt destiny, to turn fire into stone and stone into story. Long enough for the earth to forget pain, remember promise, and begin, always, again. At the edges of the world, where night and day stretched into months, the warmth arrived last. But once it came, it lingered. The poles, long accustomed to silence and frost, began to murmur. Ice that had endured for centuries wept from beneath, turning to streams that cut through blue shadows. The air smelled faintly of resin again, carried from forests creeping northward, tentative yet determined. In places where tundra had once lain pale and bare, green returned. Small ferns, conifers, and hardy shrubs taking root in thawed soil. The world's fever had reached its extremities, and even here at the planet's crown and heel, the pulse of fire could be felt. At first, it was subtle. Summers grew longer, their light more persistent. The great rivers that fed northern plains ran high with meltwater that no longer froze in early autumn. Lakes that had once held ice year-round rippled free under pale, endless suns. The boundaries between seasons blurred, and the old rhythms, migration, hibernation, bloom, began to drift out of sync. Animals that had evolved to depend on predictability found their calendars useless. For every creature that adapted, another fell behind. The warmth did not come alone. Moisture followed it, drawn by shifting winds and open seas. Where cold air had once kept storms at bay, clouds now marched freely across the poles, spilling rain where snow had rained for millennia. Thunder rolled in places that had never heard its voice. With each storm, layers of ice softened, melted, and refroze, sealing bubbles of the new atmosphere inside, the signatures of carbon and heat that future scientists would one day find and decode like messages in glass. In the sediment beneath thawing lakes, fine particles of pollen began to appear. Each grain was a traveler, carried from forests far to the south, landing on water that reflected skies too warm for its latitude. Over centuries, those pollen grains layered into bands of mud, building a quiet record of expansion. When modern eyes would later slice through those cores, they would see not numbers, but stories. Forests inching north year by year, then mile by mile, until the poles themselves no longer looked like endings, but new beginnings of green. Yet even as warmth brought growth, it also brought fragility. The soil, freshly exposed, was shallow and thin, unable to hold the surge of life for long. When rains came heavy, roots tore free, and nutrients washed away into rivers that carried them to seas, already gasping for oxygen. Insects flourished briefly, tiny engineers of decay, buzzing among the first flowers to open beneath midnight suns. Some became trapped in tree resin, their small bodies sealed in golden prisons. Millions of years later, their amber coffins would gleam in museum light, each containing a whisper of those transient polar summers when forests brushed the edges of the world. At the farthest reaches, where ice still held fast, the warmth arrived not as thaw but as tension. Glaciers creaked, veins of meltwater carving through their bellies, turning the frozen silence into a landscape of sound. Cracking, sighing, collapsing. The weight of ice, once steady, now shifted unpredictably. From above, the low sun glanced off surfaces dappled with melt pools that mirrored the sky in trembling blues. It was beauty, born of imbalance, and in it, the Earth's extremes spoke in unison, north answering south, both echoing the same fevered song. Geologists studying ancient ice cores would later find trapped within them not only air, but memory. Layers of dust and ash carried on global winds from eruptions far away. Signals proving that the polar changes were no local anomaly, but part of the same planetary drama. The poles had acted as amplifiers, their delicate balance magnifying what began elsewhere. When the equator burned, the poles whispered. When the warmth persisted, the whispers became thunder. Even in those ages of upheaval, there were moments of stillness. Picture a northern twilight that lasts for weeks, the sky painted copper by distant aerosols, the land beneath it soft with thawing moss. Somewhere, a stream gurgles through what was once glacier, and above it, the faint hum of insects. Fragile wings catching the last golden light before the long night begins again. It is the sound of adaptation, of life making space even in contradiction. Darkness overhead, warmth beneath, and a world learning to live between. When the great burn eventually waned and climates settled once more, the forests would retreat. The frost would reclaim its ground, and ice would creep outward again. But the memory, warmth would remain, locked in sediments and amber, waiting to be rediscovered. For the poles, those quiet corners of the planet had served as mirrors to its moods. They had recorded every breath of the fire age, every oscillation of heat and cold, every sigh of the earth as it turned beneath its changing sky. And so, when we study them now, cores of ancient ice, veins of red clay beneath frozen seas, we are not just reading about the past. We are listening to the echoes of a fever that once gripped the whole planet. A chorus that began at the equator and ended in the cold silence of the poles. In those echoes is a truth older than ice. No place, however distant or frozen, escapes the pulse of a living, changing earth. It began not with trees or rivers, but with dust. The black plains of basalt, still warm in their cores, lay bare and glimmering beneath pale skies. For centuries, they had been silent, broken only by the hiss of rain or the groan of distant stone. Then, in crevices where water lingered longest, something stirred. Spores, tiny, weightless travelers carried by wind, found resting places in the hairline cracks. They had no roots, no stems, only a hunger for foothold. When the rains came again, thin films of moisture woke them. Green spread not in forests, but as a faint shimmer, a whisper of color against the dark. The first pioneers were lichens, partnerships of fungus and alga, two lives woven into one. They clung to the rock face like frost, secreting acids that bit at the mineral surface. Bit by bit, they dissolved stone into soil, creating what the next arrivals would need. It was slow work, almost invisible, but relentless. For every century of quiet weathering, a few more grains of dust joined the thin crust of life. From that dust, the planet began to breathe again. Fungi spread next, webbing through cracks and hollows like threads of thought, connecting everything that lived on the surface. They were unseen architects, breaking down the first wave of dead cells, recycling what little carbon existed into nourishment. Some formed secret partnerships with roots that hadn't yet appeared, waiting for the plants to come. In the meantime, they prepared the ground, blending the minerals of lava with the ghosts of once living things, a communion of stone and life that marked the true beginning of recovery. Then came the mosses, delicate as sighs, their soft mats creeping across slopes that had once run molten. They trapped dust and water, stabilizing what had been loose and lifeless. In their shade, other things began to stir. Tiny worms, insect larvae, unseen creatures that chewed the moss and in turn enriched the soil with their waste. This was how creation always began, quietly and humbly. Not with thunder or flame, but with the rustle of small lives. When the first ferns appeared, their fronds rising like cautious hands from the rubble, the land had already begun to change. Each leaf caught rain and shade, offering refuge for smaller plants. Each root pushed deeper, prying open rock, making room for air and water to mix below the surface. In this mingling of stone, fungus, and root, a thin skin of fertility spread. Hills that had once glowed red and black took on a green haze, as though morning had returned after an endless night. Insects followed the scent of green. Wind carried them, winged beetles, ancient dragonflies, and smaller, humbler forms. They found the ferns and mosses rich in pollen and sap. Some stayed, others died, and became part of the soil. Their presence meant something new. Pollination, mobility, a way for the land to knit itself faster. Life was no longer crawling, it was exchanging, negotiating, moving. Every wing beat was a transaction. The rivers, still fickle from the world's long fever, brought more gifts. Each flood deposited silt and clay, minerals washed from distant cliffs. When the waters receded, they left ribbons of fertile ground and seeds, simple, wind-blown capsules that had survived in distant refuges. Some landed and failed, but some endured. With every failure, a trace of nutrients remained, feeding the next. Slowly, layer upon layer, the soil thickened. At night, when the air cooled and the land radiated heat from its heart, condensation formed on the moss, dripping like dew. The sound of it was faint but constant, a steady rhythm of renewal. Microbes thrived in those droplets, unseen worlds within worlds, cycling nitrogen, fixing carbon, turning the invisible into the tangible. They were the caretakers of the new earth, working without rest or recognition, as they always had. From a distance, centuries later, the transformation would seem sudden. Barren basalt turned to meadow, ash plains to forest. But up close, it was never abrupt. Each step took hundreds of years. Each advance was won grain by grain. The green that spread across the black rock was not conquest, but conversation. Every leaf spoke to the soil beneath it, every spore to the wind, every droplet to the stone. It is tempting to imagine the earth healing as an act of drama, a single bloom, a sudden flood of color. But the truth is softer. Recovery is patience made visible. The smallest things lead, and the rest follow. Life, humbled by catastrophe, begins again not with roar, but with whisper. In time, the whispers join, and from them rises the hum of a planet remembering how to grow. By the time forests would once again cast shadows across these basalt hills, no trace would remain of the silence that came before. Only the layered soil, the minerals softened by roots, and the faint memory of black stone beneath the green, an echo of the moment when Earth, after its million-year burn, first began to breathe again. The forests that returned were not the same as the ones that had burned. They were leaner, more cunning, their leaves thicker and their roots deeper. Every creature that moved among them carried the memory of fire in its bones. The old designs, large, extravagant, wasteful, had vanished. In their place came a world tuned to survival. Every form an answer to scarcity, every gesture a calculation. The earth had become a workshop, and evolution its patient craftsman, working long hours under dim light. Tools spread across a table made of time. Seeds were among the first to change. Once, plants had cast them freely, trusting abundance to ensure survival. Now, they hardened their gifts, wrapping embryos in shells strong enough to endure drought, heat, or burial under ash. Some seeds learned to wait, dormant through centuries if need be, until conditions whispered of rain and safety. Others carried small reserves of food, a head start for sprouting in impoverished soils. Each strategy was a note in a growing symphony of resilience. Leaves, too, altered their grammar. Instead of broad, feathery fronds that drank sunlight without thought, new plants grew narrow blades, rolled edges, waxed coatings to keep water close. Chemistry evolved alongside form. Bitter oils, resins, and toxins appeared in leaves and bark. A quiet arms race between plant and herbivore. To eat, animals would have to adapt, building new stomachs, new teeth, new patience. Insects, those earliest of colonists, were already ahead of the curve. Some evolved mouthparts capable of piercing the toughened leaves. Others shifted to sap, pollen, or decay, becoming the first recyclers of the new forests. Their wings grew narrower for maneuvering through dense canopies. Colors changed too, camouflage born not of artistry, but necessity. A green shell meant one more day of safety. A brown wing meant a predator's confusion. Among the larger animals, the experiments grew bolder. Herbivores developed molars with ridged enamel, teeth that could grind down fibrous, bitter plants. Their digestive systems turned inventive, fermenting cellulose, brewing microbial allies in their guts to pull nutrition from what had once been inedible. They grew smaller, quicker, needing less to survive, their bodies tuned to endurance rather than display. Predators answered in kind. Without vast herds to chase, they learned patience. Muscles coiled for sudden movement rather than long pursuit. Jaws narrowed, claws sharpened. Ambush replaced the grand chase. To live in these young forests meant listening more than seeing, waiting in shadow until opportunity breathed close. Silence became its own strategy. Even the water breathers adapted. Lakes and rivers, still prone to chemical mood swings, favored creatures that could tolerate both feast and famine of oxygen. Gills became more efficient. Some paired with primitive lungs that could gulp air when water grew thin. In swamps, amphibians experimented with skin that could drink oxygen straight from the air. Breathing, once a reflex, became an art. Everywhere, life shrank and simplified before it expanded again. In that contraction lay creativity. Metabolisms turned thrifty, wasting nothing. Eggs grew fewer but hardier. Growth slowed, but learning, through instinct, through behavior, quickened. What couldn't be changed by body was changed by habit. Evolution was no longer just about form. It was about timing, cunning, restraint. In the soil beneath these forests, fungi and roots continued their partnership, refining an invisible economy. Nutrients moved in barter networks, carried along fungal filaments that stitched the forest together beneath the ground. A single tree might share minerals with another miles away, a cooperation that made the forest less a collection of individuals and more a single, pulsing organism. Out of crisis had come communion. If you could walk through those forests, you might not notice the genius at first. The canopy would seem sparse, the animals small, the air quiet. But listen closely, and you would hear the hum of invention, a world retooling itself molecule by molecule. Leaves adjusting their chemistry with each season, insects learning new songs to match new flowers, predators altering their strike by milliseconds. Every species was an engineer, every encounter a test. And through it all, time kept the workshop lit. What failed was recycled. What succeeded was refined. A leg slightly longer, a jaw a shade stronger, a heartbeat quicker at dawn. Nothing happened quickly, yet everything moved forward, imperceptibly but inevitably. The rawness of survival shaped precision. From this crucible would come the great dynasties of the future. The reptiles that would rule, the mammals that would wait in their shadows, the flowering plants that would later clothe the world in scent and color. But here, in this age of quiet recovery, the focus was not grandeur, but resilience. Evolution hummed softly in the background, content to tinker, to polish, to keep what worked. The earth had burned, cooled, and healed. Now it was inventing again, not for beauty, not for dominance, but for endurance. The forests whispered with new life, green on black, alive with experiment. And under that whisper, steady as a heartbeat, the great machine of adaptation turned, unhurried and unstoppable, crafting the next world from the ruins of the last. The world, after all its convulsions, began to exhale. The air that had once shimmered with heat and poison softened almost imperceptibly. There were still traces of the old fever, faint breaths of carbon, sulfur's tang after rain. But the balance was shifting. The long exhalation of volcanoes was quieting. The fires that had reshaped continents dimmed to embers beneath the crust. For the first time in what felt like forever, the earth paused between heartbeats. Healing, in this age, was not dramatic. It happened molecule by molecule, in silences so deep that only the stones kept count. The basalt plains that had once poured rivers of molten rock now met the sky with patience. Rain, falling more often now, kissed their dark surfaces and began the work of weathering. Each droplet carried a whisper of carbon dioxide dissolved from the air. When it met the rock, a slow conversation began. Acids etching minerals, freeing ions, locking carbon away as new crystals formed. The process was invisible but vast, the atmosphere giving itself back to the ground, one raindrop at a time. Mountains, too, joined the effort. Their peaks, once naked and sharp from uplift, began to crumble under the combined forces of frost, root, and wind. Every flake of weathered stone carried with it a fraction of the air's old burden. Rivers gathered these grains and swept them toward the sea, where they settled in layered beds. There, chemistry changed again. In the shallow, sunlit waters, plankton bloomed, spinning dissolved carbon into shells of calcium carbonate. When they died, their bodies rained down as fine white snow, burying carbon in silence. Over eons, these sediments would compress into limestone and shale, rock ledgers tallying the debt of the sky. The oceans, those vast and steady lungs, grew calmer. Their currents slowed, their chemistry steadied. Carbon dioxide, once saturating their surfaces, began to sink into deeper layers, drawn downward by cold water descending at the poles. The deep sea became a vault, a hidden reservoir where the planet stored what it no longer needed above. For the creatures that lived there, the small, translucent swimmers and the blind scavengers, the change was gradual, almost kind. The water no longer burned with acid, shells thickened, reefs began tentatively to rebuild. Above the waves, the air cooled. Seasons grew more distinct again. The long summers of endless haze gave way to balanced rhythms. Spring rains, autumn chills, winter's quiet. Forests responded like instruments retuned. Growth slowed but deepened. Trees laid down denser wood, rings that would later record each sigh of the recovering climate. The green world, once frantic in its comeback, now settled into something closer to harmony. In this calmer light, even the clouds changed. They hung lower, heavier with moisture. Their shadows drifted across the land in slow procession, casting patterns that reminded the earth of movement without violence. Every storm carried not destruction, but renewal, washing dust into rivers, feeding the next round of weathering. Healing, it turned out, did not require stillness. It required rhythm. The silicate weathering that had begun quietly after the eruptions now ran full and strong, a planetary pulse. When the air grew rich with carbon, weathering quickened. When the air cleared, it slowed. The planet, without awareness yet full of wisdom, had built its own brake system. Not swift, not merciful, but real. No hand adjusted it. No mind designed it. It was the arithmetic of chemistry and time. Each mountain eroded was a fraction of balance restored. Each river delta, each shell on the sea floor, was a ledger entry toward stability. From the vantage of deep time, this was the lull between storms. But to any creature alive then, a fern, an insect, a small reptile basking on basalt, it felt like the return of peace. Days were gentler. The air no longer shimmered with toxins. Skies were blue again, though still streaked with faint bands of haze that caught the sunset in ochre and rose. The land, newly clothed in green, no longer hissed when rain fell. The sound of water on leaves replaced the sound of fire on stone. If one could listen closely enough, the world now hummed in a lower key. Rivers wore canyons into the basalt, slow as thought. Roots pried pebbles apart, turning rock into soil, soil into life. Each act of erosion was an act of repair. The great systems, atmosphere, ocean, mountain, and rain, worked together like organs in a body remembering health. There was no celebration, no instant of completion, only continuity. The earth healed not by miracle, but by habit, not by forgiveness, but by persistence. Carbon flowed where it needed to go. Warmth receded to comfort. Over millions of seasons, the fever broke. The air thinned to clarity. The world that had burned for an age finally rested its head, not in sleep, but in balance. And in that balance, the story continued, not ended, only softened. A lullaby of patience, written in raindrops on stone. The story of fire did not end with the cooling of the basalt or the settling of the air. Fire was never truly banished. It only changed its shape. What once poured from rifts and mountains now flickers in forests, in the lightning that dances through clouds, in the slow burn of decay. The earth, ever a creature of cycles, remembered its own lessons. Carbon still moves from stone to sky and back again, carried not just by volcanoes, but by roots, oceans, and breath. The conversations that began in deep time continue now, quieter perhaps, but no less important. When the ancient world burned for 1,000,000 years, it taught the planet how to balance itself, how to listen to excess, to draw heat back into the ground, to turn disaster into renewal. The silicate weathering that once cooled the earth still works beneath our feet, drop by drop. The plankton that calmed the ancient seas still bloom today, spinning sunlight into carbon and carbon into shell. Forests, the descendants of those first green pioneers on black rock, still hold the air in trust. They take the breath of the sky and give it back as life. These are the same systems, the same patient mechanisms, the same long arithmetic of survival. Only the tempo has changed. Now, in our age, the feedbacks hum again. A familiar tune played in a faster key. The oceans, as before, are taking in carbon, not willingly, but dutifully, becoming more acidic with every sigh. The air warms, the poles soften, and storms grow louder. Coral reefs bleach as ancient reefs once did. Forests shift their borders northward, echoing the migrations of trees after the Great Burn. None of it is new. It is repetition, but sped up, condensed from geologic tempo into human time. The difference is not in the pattern, but in our presence to witness it. We have become participants in the same conversation that once belonged only to mountains and seas. Every action, the coal drawn from buried swamps, the gas freed from ancient shales, is a hand stirring an old memory. The carbon that once smothered the Triassic world is the same carbon that now fuels our lights, our movement, our lives. The atoms remember. They have cycled through leaves, shells, bones, and flames before. When they rise into the air again, they carry with them the history of fire. And yet, this is not a story of despair. The earth has seen worse. It has stumbled into heat and found its balance again, though not easily, not quickly. It took the patience of rain on stone, the quiet labor of microbes, the discipline of time itself. The question now is not whether the planet can recover. It can, it will. But whether we can learn to match its patience with wisdom. Time is long, but choice is short. When we look at stronger storms, we are seeing old feedbacks reawakened. When reefs turn white, we are seeing the ocean's own reminder that chemistry listens to everything. When species wander to higher ground or higher latitudes, we are watching the map of life redraw itself, as it has done before, when fire was sky-deep and lava rimmed the continents. The rhyme is clear, but the verse is ours to finish. To stand in this present moment is to stand between past and future. One foot on cooled basalt, the other on the soil we make today. We are, in a sense, another pulse in the planet's story, a bright flare of consciousness within the endless exchange of carbon and light. The question is not only what we will do, but how we will listen. The earth does not speak in warnings, only in echoes. The storms and droughts, the melting and blooming. These are not punishments, but reminders. If we listen the way the lichens once did, the way rivers do, we can hear that balance is still possible. The chemistry that draws carbon from the air still functions. The forests still drink light. The oceans still breathe, though more shallowly now. The systems that healed the planet after its long fever are still here, waiting for our partnership rather than our command. Fire has always been both destroyer and teacher. It shows how fragile stability is and how resilient renewal can be. The same flame that consumes also clears, making space for invention. Perhaps that is what this moment asks of us. To remember the old lesson that the earth learned slowly, painfully, beautifully. that time and action matter, and that healing is not an act of hope alone, but of work, patience, and humility. The planet, for all its memory of fire, is not angry. It is merely awake. It listens to every breath, every spark, every change we make. And as it once cooled itself with stone and rain, it waits again for us to join in the rhythm, to play our small part in the long conversation that has never truly ended. The fire that once tore the world apart did not only destroy, it built. The same flows that seared forests and boiled seas left behind the foundations of new continents, the raw materials for future civilizations. What was once molten chaos cooled into pattern and purpose. The black plains of basalt that spread across ancient earth hardened into quiet strength, their surfaces broken by cracks that would one day cradle water and life. Time, that master craftsman, began its long work of turning ruin into resource. When basalt cools, it contracts, fracturing into hexagonal columns that fit together like the tessellated floor of a cathedral. Rain slips through these joints, collecting in deep fractures where heat once pulsed. Over millions of years, those fissures become reservoirs, natural aquifers that hold the planet's cleanest water. Even now, cities draw their drinking supply from the veins of long-dead lava, the melt of mountain snow filtering through stone forged in fire. What was once magma now gives the gift of purity. The earth remembers how to sustain even in the shadow of destruction. As weathering continues, basalt transforms again. The same minerals that once glowed orange with heat crumble into fine particles rich in iron, magnesium, and calcium. Mixed with rain, these fragments become the world's most fertile soils, dark, dense, alive with nutrients. Farmers know them by touch. Loamy, generous, capable of feeding whatever root takes hold. From India's Deccan Plateau to Hawaii's slopes, from the highlands of Ethiopia to Iceland's green valleys, the ground beneath the plow is cooled fire. Vineyards cling to the sides of ancient flows, coffee groves rise from cinder cones, forests thrive where lava once ran like blood. Out of catastrophe came agriculture. Out of basalt came bread and wine. Beneath these rich topsoils, metals rest: iron, copper, nickel, platinum, the hardened remnants of the planet's fiery youth. Volcanoes that once roared now sleep beneath layers of green, but within their roots lie the veins of tomorrow's machines. Humanity mines what the fire locked away: the scaffolding for cities, the circuits for thought. The very minerals that painted the ancient sky red now run in wires beneath our feet, carrying light where darkness used to rule. The old heat still moves through us, disguised as electricity. Even the dangers that linger are part of the legacy. Thin soils can erode easily. Slopes can slip after heavy rains. Gases once vented by magma, radon, carbon dioxide, sometimes seep unseen through the ground, a quiet reminder that the earth never truly forgets its past. Living atop cooled fire requires respect as much as reliance. The land is generous but not docile. It remembers its volatility even as it cradles us. In the old basalt provinces, life learned resilience early. The fractures and hollows left by cooling flows became refuges for seeds, nests for birds, dens for mammals. Pools formed in depressions where gas once bubbled through molten rock. Each one was a microcosm, a small world rebuilding itself. Over time, these scattered habitats merged into ecosystems. The scars of eruption became corridors of renewal. The pattern still holds. Disturbance followed by richness, the pulse of destruction feeding creation. Humans came late to this inheritance, but they understood it intuitively. Settlements rose where rivers ran over lava beds, where soils were rich and springs ran clear. Cities like Auckland, Quito, and Reykjavik stand today on basalt's old backbone. Roads follow the contours of cooled flows, buildings draw stone from ancient vents. Even the glass in windows and screens owes something to volcanic chemistry. Silica refined from the same minerals that once glowed beneath the crust. Without those ancient furnaces, our modern world, its tools, its architecture, its sustenance, would not exist. Sometimes, at sunset, you can still see the fire's fingerprint. The land catches the light differently on basalt, deeper, darker, almost metallic. The air above such ground feels faintly charged, as though remembering heat long spent. Vineyards trace patterns along the slopes, green against black, vines feeding from the minerals that once fueled an apocalypse. Lakes shimmer in old calderas, blue mirrors in bowls of stone. Towns and roads sprawl across plains that were once seas of lava, unaware that every foundation is a chapter of prehistory. The Earth's disasters are never final. What burns becomes scaffold, what falls becomes seed. The planet's gift is transformation, the slow alchemy that turns fire into fruit, ash into soil, and stone into home. We live, quite literally, upon the ruins of catastrophe. Each field, each city, each sip of water drawn from volcanic rock is a continuation of that story. It is easy to think of ancient lava as a thing of the past, a memory buried beneath our feet. But the truth is simpler and more intimate. Every mountain, every valley, every blade of grass growing in dark soil is a sentence in the story that began with flame. Yesterday's fire hardened into the floor of our world, and on that cooled foundation, tomorrow continues to build. The land, in all its quiet generosity, is proof that even the fiercest fury can leave behind something worth keeping. A home shaped by heat, tempered by time, and sustained by the patient mercy of stone. The story of survival is not only written in stone, but within us. Long after the basalt cooled and forests returned, the descendants of those who endured carried traces of the ordeal, invisible but indelible. Every living thing that exists today is the echo of an ancient narrowing, a lineage that passed through the eye of the needle and emerged changed. Catastrophe, in its strange way, became a teacher not just of behavior, but of biology. The bodies that crawled, burrowed, flew, or swam through the world's recovery bore the marks of crisis in their very cells. When the great burning ended, the earth was emptier, but not silent. The survivors were the adaptable, the cautious, the small. They were creatures that could live with less air, less food, less certainty. From these came the blueprints of endurance that would one day shape us all. DNA, that quiet archivist, took notes as time unfolded. Mutations that once meant mere survival became the raw material of future potential. Flexibility in metabolism, tolerance to heat or cold, the ability to wait out bad seasons. All these became inheritance, passed from mother to offspring, from one epoch to the next. In the bones of tiny reptiles that darted through fern forests, scientists would later find evidence of shrinking, a phenomenon called the Lilliput effect, when life itself contracts to fit the narrow doorway of catastrophe. Smaller bodies need less energy, less oxygen. They can hide in shadows, burrow into cool soil, live where giants cannot. Those proportions, once an emergency measure, lingered. Generations later, when warmth and abundance returned, the small and clever did not immediately grow large again. Their caution had become part of them. Within their genes, remnants of those adjustments remained. Switches that turned metabolism low when food was scarce, lungs that drew oxygen efficiently even in thin air, hearts that slowed in cold nights. The crisis had imprinted not just who lived, but how living was done. Evolution is memory by other means, a notebook written in base pairs instead of ink. It records not dates or names, but solutions, patterns that worked when the world was fragile. Each species carries its own marginalia, the chemical signatures of ancient fear and quiet perseverance. For mammals, the lessons were profound. Their ancestors, small nocturnal creatures that crept through underbrush while reptiles ruled the sun, had learned the virtues of darkness. Large predators, once toppled by the extinction, left behind a gap that the meek filled slowly, carefully. The mammal's ancestors thrived not by dominance, but by discretion. They listened to the ground, felt vibrations through whiskers, smelled the world before they saw it. In their genes, the memory of danger rewired senses, sharpening them. Warm blood, once a quirk, became armor against cold nights and unstable climates. Milk, a means of feeding young and hiding, became a revolution in continuity. The same pressures that sculpted animals sculpted plants. Those that survived the great burn passed on their strategies in pollen and seed. Thicker casings, deeper roots, faster germination after fire. Trees that learned to sprout from ash would one day populate landscapes far beyond their original range. The forests of the future, and the creatures within them, all bore the invisible fingerprints of a world that had once demanded resilience as the price of survival. Even now, millions of years later, we carry those echoes. Our own genome is a museum of ancient crises, genes for hypoxia tolerance, for fasting, for storing fat against famine. We still respond to stress in ways that recall an age when scarcity and heat ruled. Our adrenal systems, our circadian rhythms, our instinct to prepare for what's coming, all of them are gifts from ancestors who lived through deep instability. The same biological language that whispered survival in the Triassic still murmurs beneath our skin. When scientists study these lineages, sequencing DNA that loops back through time, they can see the story unfold like strata in rock. Population bottlenecks appear as constrictions, times when diversity dipped before branching anew. Every narrowing leaves a scar of similarity, a shared ancestry that binds survivors more tightly together. In our cells are the signatures of those squeezes, not just in numbers, but in adaptability. Life, when cornered, does not surrender. It edits itself. And so, even in comfort, we remain the children of fire and shadow. We are tuned to fluctuation, built for seasons that shift, wired to adapt. Our restlessness, our ingenuity, our craving for shelter and warmth, all of it comes from the long night when the world nearly went still. The catastrophe shaped not just the planet's surface, but its inhabitants' souls, embedding resilience into the fabric of heredity. The earth healed in minerals and weather. Life healed in code. Genes remembered where stories could not. Each of us, in every breath and heartbeat, repeats the triumph of those early survivors. The blueprint they left within us is not one of perfection, but of persistence, a testament that every ending, if endured long enough, becomes the beginning of design. The morning begins before the sun. In the half-light, the camp is quiet except for the low murmur of a kettle and the distant hum of insects waking in the scrub. Coffee steams from tin mugs, dark and bitter, its scent mingling with dust and dew. Around the folding table, scientists gather, their jackets already speckled with the rust red of the land they've come to study. Maps are unfolded, corners weighted with stones. The talk is soft but charged, about coordinates, about the layer they might reach today, about what story the rock will tell when they cut it open. Then, with thermoses filled and packs strapped, they step into the chill and walk toward the basalt hills, their boots crunching on the skin of a world millions of years older than memory. The climb is slow but deliberate. The landscape stretches in terraces of black and red, each step a page in the Earth's long diary. The air smells faintly of iron and sage. Between the cracks, tufts of grass tremble in the morning wind. When the first sunlight spills across the horizon, it strikes the basalt columns like the ribs of a sleeping giant, lighting their edges in gold. Someone pauses to take a photograph, but mostly they move in silence, reverence mixed with focus. Here, even silence feels like part of the data. At the day's first stop, they crouch along an exposed cliff face. The lead geologist, gray-haired and steady-handed, traces a finger along a seam no wider than a coin. "There," she says softly, as if naming a constellation. Beneath the surface glints a thin band of ash, fine as flour and dull as soot. The others lean in, passing a hand lens from one to another. Through the glass, the layer comes alive. Fragments of glassy shards, tiny crystals, the frozen exhale of an eruption long gone. Notes are scrawled in waterproof journals, coordinates recorded, samples chiseled free with care. In a few months, this same dust will sit beneath a microscope or hum inside a mass spectrometer, and the numbers will whisper of ancient skies and vanished seas. Farther upslope, the drill team begins its rhythm. The machine stutters and whirs, its bit biting into basalt that has not seen daylight in 200 million years. Each core emerges in smooth cylinders, gleaming where the rock was cut. They lift it like treasure, wiping it clean with brushes, labeling each segment with calm precision. The cores are stacked in wooden boxes, gray spirals of time, each turn a revelation. When the drilling pauses, someone runs a gloved hand along a polished surface, tracing the faint variations in color. Mercury spike, murmurs another. Volcanic pulse, maybe. The excitement is quiet but contagious. This is how discovery often feels, not thunderous, but intimate, like hearing a heartbeat through a stethoscope. By noon, the sun is merciless. The team eats in the shadow of a boulder, red dust clinging to every sandwich and sleeve. Laughter rises easily now. Field jokes, small complaints about the heat, the drone of insects competing with the click of cameras. A stray gust sends notes fluttering across the ground, chased quickly, gathered again. Someone points toward the horizon, where a river cuts through a cliff, its cross-section revealing striped bands of basalt, sandstone, ash. "That's the whole story right there," they say, half in wonder, half in disbelief. 1,000,000 years written in a wall of stone. In the afternoon, the team moves to catalog fossils from a nearby plain. Each bone fragment is lifted gently, brushed, measured, photographed. The paleontologist's notebook is thick with smudges, graphite, dirt, sweat. Between entries, she writes small observations. Weathered surface smooth, water action likely. Surrounding sediment reddish, oxidized floodplain. The handwriting tilts slightly, as if hurrying to keep up with thought. Science here looks less like certainty and more like devotion. Evening brings the soft hiss of wind through basalt cracks. The sky bruises purple, and the first stars appear, bright against the cooling air. Back at camp, samples are packed, labels double-checked, data logged by lantern light. Laughter drifts from the cooking area. The sound of colleagues turned companions. Someone reads aloud from the day's notes. Another sketches in a field book, capturing the curve of the cliffs under moonlight. No one speaks of discovery in grand terms. They speak instead of texture, of weight, of how the ash crumbles between their fingers. In the lab, months later, the work continues under different light, fluorescent, cold, methodical. Machines hum, measuring isotopes, translating stone into numbers. The smell of dust lingers even here. Across the world, other labs are doing the same. Testing, comparing, sharing results. Cores travel between continents. Data flows across oceans. Knowledge expands not by sudden leaps, but by a network of small, careful hands. In museum drawers, the samples rest, labeled, dated, catalogued. Visitors rarely see them, but the scientists know each one by heart. Basalt from the Nourian layer, shale from an ancient river delta, bone from the floodplain where red dust still clings. Together, they form a quilt, patches of understanding stitched across time and space. To study the past is to love it, even when it burned. The scientists who walk these ridges do so not out of nostalgia, but reverence, for the patience of stone, for the stories still buried. They know that every grain of ash, every fossilized root, every isotope curve is a sentence in the Earth's autobiography. And when they kneel before a rock face, lenses gleaming in the sun, they are not just reading history. They are listening to the faint, enduring voice of a planet still speaking, softly through stone. The last embers of Earth's long fever cooled slowly, like coals buried under ash. For generations upon generations, the ground still whispered of heat, but the violence that once defined the world was gone. The sky, once bronze and bruised, began to clear. Bit by bit, sunlight returned, not the harsh glare that had baked the land in the age of fire, but a gentler warmth filtered through clean air. Mornings arrived with color again. Blue, impossible blue, filled the heavens where haze and ash had ruled. And beneath that quiet rebirth, the planet took its first steady breath in 1,000,000 years. Forests were among the first to stir. Saplings rose from soil that had been remade, their roots pushing into mineral-rich ground left behind by ancient flows. Ferns unfurled beside the blackened trunks of their ancestors. Early conifers lifted spindly arms toward the light, drawing strength from a sun that once scorched but now soothed. The air carried the scent of rain on basalt, of green pressing against gray. It was a perfume of recovery, fragile yet insistent. Life, though battered, was not vanquished. It simply waited for the right moment to return. Rivers, once swollen with ash and heat, now ran clear again, their banks reshaped by ages of erosion and flood. The waters carried the story of transformation. Minerals dissolved from mountains, nutrients from decayed forests. The dust of once fiery stone ground into fine silt. In their steady murmuring, you could almost hear the echo of what had been lost and the promise of what would come. Oceans, too, found their rhythm once more. Currents, long stalled by warmth and stagnation, began to flow freely, churning oxygen through depths that had gone breathless. With each passing century, color returned to coral ancestors. Plankton bloomed anew, and the long quiet of extinction gave way to a new chorus. Animals emerged from their refuges, tentative at first, testing a world they no longer recognized. Small, quick creatures, descendants of those that had hidden in burrows, under rocks, in the coolness of caves, ventured into the open. Their shapes were familiar, yet changed, honed by hardship. They sniffed the air, now sharp with life, and found it good. Insects thrummed over flowers that had not existed before. Amphibians croaked from clear pools. Reptiles sunned themselves on the edges of fresh lava cliffs now softened by moss. Evolution's quiet machinery turned again, adjusting, rebalancing, inventing. The planet's pulse, which had once faltered, now beat with calm determination. The basalt plains that once glowed like molten rivers had become monuments of endurance. Rain had carved gullies through them, wind had sculpted their faces, and time had softened their edges. What was once a scar became a canvas. On those dark rocks, new soils gathered, holding the beginnings of grasslands and forests. The black steppes of ancient lava turned green, and from the air, the land looked as if the planet itself had healed. A mosaic of new life painted over the remnants of catastrophe. The scars remained, but they no longer screamed. They whispered, and their whisper was one of balance restored. In that new dawn, the earth felt older and wiser, its surface etched with memory. The forces that had burned it were still alive deep below, mantle plumes dreaming in silence. But on the surface, peace had returned. The air shimmered with the low hum of insects, the rush of water, the rustle of leaves. Clouds drifted lazily, their reflections dancing across rivers and seas. If the planet could sigh, it would have been in relief, a long exhale after ages of holding breath through storm and flame. And somewhere, hidden in that reborn world, tiny creatures carried the future within them. In their blood, their bones, their code, lay the lessons of survival and change. They would give rise to new forms, new dynasties, new dreams. Each generation would build upon the quiet triumph of the last, moving forward without knowing the vast story beneath their feet. Life, as it always does, forgot the pain and remembered the pattern. To adapt, to continue, to fill every niche left empty by fire. Millions of years later, when thinking beings would walk these lands, dig through the layers, and wonder how the world had burned for 1,000,000 years, they would find the clues etched in stone, the mercury traces, the basalt steps, the fossils turned to glassy ghosts. They would learn that even the fiercest inferno has an ending, that every epoch of destruction carries the seeds of renewal. And in that realization, they would glimpse themselves, not apart from the story, but written within it. The dawn after fire was quiet, but not empty. It was a breath between chapters, a moment of balance before the next unfolding. The earth had been remade, tempered by its own ferocity, stronger and stranger than before. Life had not conquered flame, it had danced with it, survived it, and grown from its embers. Now, under a sky clear and kind, the planet stood ready once more. What would come next was unwritten. The rise of new creatures, the shaping of continents, the long, slow waltz of evolution resuming its pace. The fires that once seemed endless had given way to light. And as the first true sunrise touched the cooling stones, the earth turned its face to the warmth. Calm at last, alive once more, and waiting, forever waiting, for the next story to begin.